Kristen Holmes is the Vice President of Performance Science at WHOOP,
who has access to health data from hundreds of thousands of people. And her groundbreaking research will tell you the secrets of achieving perfect health and performance.
Matthew Walker, neuroscientist and best-selling author,
and one of the world's leading researchers in sleep science.
Dr. Sharima is a renowned sleep doctor and performance expert
whose sleep optimization research has enhanced the careers of CEOs as well as athletes.
Daniel Lieberman.
He studies and teaches
how humans are supposed to live.
Author and professor at Harvard University.
Exercise disease, sleep nutrition.
I very much believe if you don't sleep your best, you will not be your best. Or counter to that is if your sleep is best, you will be at your best. And what that means, if I unpack that a little bit more, is we often are sacrificing our sleep. We're underslept. We often don't have good quality sleep. We're very reactive to our sleep at nighttime, and it's the last thing that we think of at the end of the day when we wrap everything up. And that's arguably not going to put ourselves up to be the best we can be in the following day, right? And for my elite athletes that I work with, when you actually get sufficient sleep, you have practices that you plan into your day and you actually are more proactive with that, it can be a game changer. And for them, when it comes to performance on the field, that can be the difference of a 9% improvement in free throw shots. It can mean reacting 12% faster. And so until you experience that, it sometimes is hard to grasp how much of a difference this can make in your life. But it is one of the foundations that will impact everything about how you function, your mood, how you feel, and ultimately perform the following day. If I could offer you, or yes, you specifically, Steve, if I could offer you something that's free and healthy and safe, that's going to help you think more clearly, make better decisions, be in a better mood, be more productive and efficient, would you want it?
Of course. How much?
Exactly. And so it's really a decision of whether you want to invest your time to be able to be more proactive with this particular area of your life to get the benefits that come down the road with it.
Sleep, I would argue, is the single most effective thing that you can do to reset your brain and body health. And I don't say that flippantly. It's not as though I'm dismissing exercise or diet. Those two things are absolutely critical. But if I were to take you, the individual, and deprive you of exercise for a day, deprive you of food for a day, deprive you of water for a day, or deprive you of sleep for a day, 24 hours, and I were to map your brain and body impairments, it's not even a competition. That one night of lost sleep relative to those other things, it dwarfs, the only thing I lose out against is oxygen. If I deprive you of oxygen, you're going to pop out of existence a little bit quicker than you will with a lack of sleep. So sleep, to me, I think, is the elixir of life. It is your life support system. And as best we can tell, I would argue it's Mother Nature's best effort yet at immortality. And so in that regard, that's why when I look across all of the studies and all of the data, it's so compelling to me. And part of the reason I think I've desperately tried, and I haven't done a good job, but I've tried to offer some public mission of reuniting humanity with the sleep that it's so bereft of, is because it does appear that there's a global sleep loss epidemic. If you look at the numbers, people are struggling so desperately with their sleep. So we have all of this knowledge, this incredible knowledge of sleep and how important it is. And it's a perfect storm colliding with this great sleep depression in modern society. And for that reason, I just felt as though, what can I do to try to help offer this voice and this science? And I am but a scientist, and I stand on the shoulders of all of my colleagues and all of these giants in the field. I'm just a researcher. So that's a little bit about, I guess, who I am, but more about why I do it and why I think it's important.
Why I sleep. I mean, I know what happens when I sleep. But do I know why my body can't just find another way? Why can't my body stay awake for the 24 hours? I know some animals, they sleep half their brain and then the other half kind of has a nap and whatever. Why do we sleep?
It's a puzzling question, because when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes no sense whatsoever. Sleep is utterly idiotic, because when you're sleeping, firstly, you're not finding a mate, you're not reproducing, you're not foraging for food, you're not caring for your young, and worst of all, you're vulnerable to predation. Now, on any one of those grounds, but especially all of them as a collective, sleep should have been strongly selected against during the course of evolution. But from best we can tell, sleep evolved with life itself on this planet, and it has fought its way through heroically every step along the evolutionary path. And what that has told us is that sleep must be essential at the most basic of biological levels. And now we understand that Mother Nature didn't make a spectacular blunder with this thing called sleep. Sleep, for example, will restock the weaponry in your immune arsenal, and it will make you a more immune sensitive individual. So you're more immune robust when you wake up. We also know that it regulates your blood sugar levels. It controls your appetite hormones. It also regulates your sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen. Sleep upstairs within the brain will fixate memories and help you learn and remember. Sleep will de-escalate anxiety. It will reduce your emotional difficulties and traumas. Sleep will actually cleanse away the Alzheimer's toxic proteins that build up in the brain. You know, the list is endless. These are all of the reasons that we need to sleep.
Sleep wake timing. So is this the same thing as your circadian rhythm? Or is
So this is one of the most, I think when we think about circadian rhythms, which is just physical, mental, and behavioral changes that happen in a 24-hour cycle, and your biological clock is kind of orchestrating these rhythms, right? And
okay, so I'm gonna have to pause and take this right back to monkey level stuff.
Yeah.
What is a circadian rhythm? As if you're explaining it to a 10-year-old.
Yeah, so it's basically physical, mental, and behavioral changes that happen over a 24-hour cycle.
Okay, so here's my read on it, and correct me if I'm wrong. There's a clock in my head.
Yes, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is the master clock.
Okay, which is somewhere in my body.
It's in the hypothalamus.
So it's in my brain. And this clock regulates every cell in my body.
Cell, tissue, organ.
Okay. And it controls the release of a chemical, which makes those cells, organs, every part of my body do stuff.
Yeah, so it is your hypothalamus. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it responds to light and it responds to darkness. Okay, so that's like the most pronounced entrainment cue for this master clock. And it then sends signals to every cell tissue in your body as to what it needs to be doing in the presence of light, in the presence of darkness. And when we are viewing light at a phase of the natural light-dark cycle, that is, if I am awake when I should be sleeping, or I am sleeping when I should be awake, when my body anticipates that, it causes huge amounts of stress in the system. If we do this once or twice, not a big deal. But if we're doing this chronically, okay, it has massive health consequences, cancer, metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, 100% of mental health issues, there will be some level of circadian disruption. Okay, so when this light information comes in and tells these clocks what to do, if I am going outside of my natural biological preferences, that is circadian disruption. And if you think about how many folks are walking around with circadian disruption, it is mind-blowing. I mean, basically the kind of the definition that's been thrown out there is if you are awake from the hours of 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., if you're awake for 2 hours between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. for 2 days per week for 25 days of the year, you qualify as a kind of card-carrying shift worker, and you likely have significant circadian disruption.
Which means that
you are at risk for some of the, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, but if you continue on that pattern that I just described, you are putting yourself at increased risk for cancer and cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction. You can have trouble having children. It impacts fertility, mental health, psychiatric disorders. There isn't a disease or disorder that circadian disruption doesn't touch.
So a way of thinking about this, so that I and everyone else can understand, is there's this master clock in our hypothalamus. Look at me, hypothalamus, and this master clock regulates all of the other clocks throughout our entire body, and there's millions of them,
right?
Basically,
yes.
And the thing that's the master clock is using as a signal, the clock in our brain, is light and darkness. That's the most reliable.
Strongest.
Yeah,
yes.
That's the signal it cares about. It listens to the most, but there's other signals as well.
Right.
And if that master clock, if I'm up at 4 a.m. and I'm looking at a light at 4 a.m., that master clock is going to start firing off chemicals to all the other clocks. And then all the clocks are going to be out of sync, because then when I wake up, it's light, and then
you're confusing.
I'm confusing my body, and it's firing off in all kinds of different ways.
Right.
So I need to form an alignment, which means basically sleeping at the right time, exposing myself to darkness at the right time, et cetera, et cetera.
Your body loves regularity. And the problem is modernity is not set up for that. We have access. I think all the circadian research, unfortunately, was done after the advent of electricity. So we're kind of fighting, this access to constant light. And we're starting to see the I think deleterious effects, or the negative consequences of exposure to light really after the sun goes down. We haven't adapted to blue light after dark, right? After the sun goes down. We have not adapted to blue light.
Blue light being the light we get from screens.
Yes. There was a study that looked at the timing of light and its impact on mood and brain circuits. And they saw that if you're viewing light between the hours of, again, this is kind of this magic window of time, 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., it actually has a pro-depressive effect. So it impacts your dopamine system, reward, motivation, right? So when we wonder, oh, what is this mental health crisis? I mean, we have to look at light first. And I just don't know. And I think what's hard about the discussion and hard about this behavior is that, it's really hard for people to not engage with their phones, before bed. That has its own addictive properties, right? But we just have to understand that our relationship to light will directly influence the trajectory of our health. There's just no question about that.
It turns out that the blue light from screens does have an impact on sleep. So there's a great study done by Harvard Medical School by some colleagues there. And they showed that reading for an hour on an iPad just before bed, relative to just reading a book in dim light, firstly, it delayed the time with which people fell asleep. So it took them a lot longer to fall asleep. Second, it reduced the total amount of sleep that they had. Third, it decreased a sleep-related hormone called melatonin. It delayed the release of that melatonin, and it reduced the amount of melatonin. And finally, it reduced the amount of rapid eye movement sleep. So it had
significantly.
The
melatonin point, how significantly?
So it delayed the release by about somewhere between 90 minutes to 2 hours across the individuals. So in other words, your brain wasn't. So what melatonin does? It's called the hormone of darkness, or the vampire hormone. Just because, not because it makes you want to bite into people's necks, but because it signals to your brain that it's nighttime, that it's darkness. And so your brain needs the signal of melatonin for it to understand when is it dark. In other words, it needs to understand by way of melatonin when it is time to fall asleep. And when you're bathed in electric light at night, and especially when you're getting blue light from these devices, your brain is fooled into thinking it's still daytime. And when there is light emitting through your retina, coming into your brain, it signals to a part of your brain to hit the brakes on melatonin. And your brain will not release melatonin. So what was happening with this iPad reading is that you were artificially telling the brain it's still daytime, and the brakes on melatonin were still shut on. And so melatonin was not starting to be released until much later. And what was also interesting about that study, by the way, is that when they stopped the iPad reading, the sleep disrupted pattern continued for several days later. In other words, it was almost like a drug, that it had a washout period, that was a blast radius to it. Now, there's been some great work by a wonderful sleep scientist in Australia, Michael Gradazar, and he has added to this story. And he said, it's not just the blue light. These devices, the principal function of these devices is that they are attention capture devices. Just like you said, I'm just going to have a wee little TikTok before bed. They are in the attention economy. And all they care about is capturing your attention for currency. And they make a lot of money from it. What that attention does is that it stimulates your brain. And when your brain is stimulated, it's very difficult for you to fall asleep. And it creates what we call sleep procrastination, where you're lying in bed and you could be perfectly sleepy and you could fall asleep right now. But then you sort of check social media and you think, oh, I'll just shoot that last email. Oh, and then I'll order that last thing on sort of, Amazon. And then you get a text back from your friend and you start texting them. And then you look up and it's now an hour later and you're an hour deficient on sleep. So it's the activation of your cerebral cortex by these devices that is perhaps the more harmful aspect of them regarding your sleep. Now, here again, I don't want to be finger wagging. The genie of technology is out the bottle and it's not going back in anytime soon. There's nothing that I'm going to say as a sleep researcher that's going to change that. I don't take my phone into my bedroom. I put my phone out in the kitchen and I don't see it until morning. But lots of people do, and fair enough. But there's another rule that I've stolen from another friend called Michael Grandner, who's here in America at the University of Tucson in Arizona. He has this great rule regarding technology, and it's the following, that if you really must take your phone into your bedroom, you can only use it standing up. And what you'll find is that after about 6 or 7 minutes standing up, you think, I'm just gonna sit down on the bed. And at that point, as soon as your backside hits the bed, you're done. You've got to put the phone away. I think it's a great rule of thumb if you need to take technology in the bedroom.
I'm going to apply that. And before you get in bed, you referenced that you read books versus being on an iPad or screens, etc. Mm-hmm. Does the same philosophy and principle apply to light exposure before sleep as to food exposure before sleep?
Oh, no question. Right. Absolutely. We want to try to restrict light. Basically, after the sun goes down, we want to dim our home environment to the degree that we can. We want to try to minimize all artificial light in the lead up to bed.
All artificial light?
Yes. Yeah. You want to make it as dim as possible. So, there are a lot of blue light blocking glasses, the filters that you can put on your iPad and your phone, activate all of those. But again, we want to protect our melatonin release, right? And for all the reasons I kind of have explained, when we don't have it is linked to every disease and disorder, right? So we know this. So we want to protect our melatonin release. And the only way we can release melatonin is by darkness. We need to be exposed to darkness in order for that master clock in our brain to know that it's time to go to sleep. And again, be able to tell our body, our tissues and organs and cells in our body what it needs to do at that moment.
I think I've always been quite dubious about sleep masks. Like, you get on those planes and they hand you a sleep mask in a little bag. I always thought, what a bunch of weirdos, like strapping that thing to your face.
Yeah.
How embarrassing. I'm one of those weirdos now.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. Even the little dot on your, from your alarm clock or your TV is going to emit enough light. We're so sensitive to light, artificial light. So natural light, like the moon, totally fine. But any other type of light is really going to impair our ability to get into these deeper stages of sleep where all the restoration and regeneration happens.
Do you use a sleep mask?
I do, yes.
What's your sort of routine there?
Just when I start to feel sleepy, I just put it on and go to bed.
Do you listen to anything when you go to sleep?
No, I don't.
Are you aware of any research that might indicate that listening to serial killer documentaries at 3 a.m.?
I think in principle, anything that activates you, stimulates you cognitively or makes you energized, you probably want to avoid reading. Yeah.
If we go back, I don't know, tens of thousands of years to how maybe some of our ancestors used to live, they would have food at certain times and they would have light exposure at certain times. They didn't have artificial light.
Right.
They hadn't invented that yet. The modern world is very much the antithesis of that.
It is.
We have food whenever we want it. We can I can order a cookie at 3 a.m. if I want to eat a cookie at 3 a.m. and I can watch a YouTube video, The Diary of a CEO, for example, and I can subscribe at any hour of the day. So is this kind of like a misalignment issue with the way our body was designed by nature and the world we now live in?
Yeah, we have not evolved to digest food in the middle of the night or to view light in the middle of the night or to be super active in the middle of the night. We just haven't. And it creates this misalignment. And, I think what's interesting if we are to kind of look at individuals, or societies currently that don't have electricity, it's really interesting to I think see some of their behaviors, some of their sleep-wake behaviors. And this is fascinating. There is a study done looking at kind of a hunter-gatherer type of society who don't have access to any electricity. And when you observe their sleep-wake times, they all fall asleep within 15 to 30 minutes of each other. And they all wake up between 15 and 30 minutes of each other. So this whole notion of chronotypes is kind of like total BS. It's because I think that's the reason a lot of people are like, oh, I have to go to bed at 1 a.m. because I'm a night owl. No, you're making a choice, generally speaking. Now, this is in healthy populations, not people who have circadian, disorders and things like that. Generally speaking, like if you were to throw everyone in this building on a mountain in Colorado, and this experiment has actually been done, with no electricity, we will literally all fall asleep within 30 minutes of each other after 48 hours. Like that is how powerful these light-dark signals are to our body. And I think that just those two examples are really compelling in that, we have evolved to kind of wake up and fall asleep in relation to this light-dark cycle.
We don't have a regular sleep and a regular wake-up time. What's actually going on from like a chemical physiological perspective?
Yeah, so one of the things that's suppressed is melatonin. And reductions in circulating melatonin have been shown to be linked to every disorder and disease in the body. Every disorder and disease in the body. When we have suppressed or reduced circulating melatonin, that is going to impact us on every level and make us more vulnerable to disease and disorders. So that is probably one of the most important thing when we have super unstable sleep-wake time. We are going to have suppressed melatonin production, which leads to inflammation in the body. It's melatonin, I think, is one of the big players in the story.
Growth hormones.
Yes. And typically, if you're not going to sleep, if you're going to sleep late, you will not release human growth hormone as you'll get less of a bolus of release.
And why does that matter?
That's when all the physical restoration happens. So all the regeneration physically. So if we're bypassing that, we're basically all the work that we did in the gym or, everything that we did during the day, we're just not going to recover from that in the same way that we would if we were getting that sleep.
Is growth hormone essentially the thing that causes our sort of muscles to grow and repair?
Yeah.
Essentially. So
yeah.
I sometimes think this because I think sometimes in my life, because I'm quite busy, I have to make the decision whether to go to the gym or get a great night's sleep.
Yeah.
And the more I've learned about growth hormone in the body and WHOOP and all those things, I've started to make the decision towards sleep versus going to the gym because my brain now goes, well, you're not going to get the recovery and sort of restoration anyway.
The benefits.
Yeah, the benefits of going to the gym if you're poorly slept that night.
Yep. I think if it's, if you're consistently getting, decent sleep and consistently getting, going to bed and wake up similar times, I would say it's okay to prioritize exercise sometimes. But sleep is very important and is probably the thing that needs to be prioritized first.
Now, there is something else that we call your chronotype. Are you a morning type, evening type, or somewhere in between? And by the way, you don't get to decide it's not your choice. You know, this notion of these go-getter type A's who say everyone has to be awake at 5 a.m. You know, you go to the gym, you blast out a workout for an hour and you're at the desk by 6 a.m. You have no choice. If you're an evening type, you're an evening type. It's hard-coded. We know that right now there's at least 22 different genes that dictate what you are, morning type, evening type, or somewhere in between. And it's about a third split across the population. Why is it a split? Why are we nicely spread out across our chronotypes? For exactly the reason you described. Because when we're in a tribe, if we all sleep at the same time, we're all vulnerable for 8 hours. But if you were to insert some genetic variability into when people have a desire to sleep, you've got the morning types who maybe go to bed at 9 p.m. and are waking up, let's say, at 5 a.m. And then you've got all of the extreme evening types who are going to bed at 2 a.m. and waking up at maybe 11 or midday. So that way, everyone gets their 8 hours of sleep, but the entire tribe, the nucleus of this group of Homo sapiens themselves, is only vulnerable for maybe just 2 or 3 hours. So it's a clever solution that Mother Nature has come up with to say everyone gets their 8 hours, but as a species, you're only going to be vulnerable for 2 to 3 hours max when everyone, at least as a collective, is sleeping. Absolute genius.
I used to think it was a load of nonsense, this chronotype thing. It was actually on this podcast where I learned about its existence, and then I went on YouTube to learn more, and your video came up of you explaining it. Because I always pondered why my partner goes to bed super early, wakes up super early. I go to bed late, wake up late. I'm going to ask you this question actually, because I've wondered this. In that situation where I'm sleeping in bed with a partner that has a different chronotype, it can have an impact on my sleep, right? Because of the way that our sleep cycles work and the REM sleep and the stage 1 deep sleep, etc., etc. If she's waking up when I'm pulling into REM sleep, i.e. if she's waking up at 5 a.m., but at 5 a.m., because I've gone to bed later, my REM sleep has just begun, that has quite a significant impact on me, right?
If she is waking you up,
if she wakes me up,
then it's non-trivial. And likewise, if you're waking her up as you're getting into bed on the front end of sleep. So it's very difficult. One of the things that couples will cite if they break up, firstly, is usually about a third of them will cite sleep difficulties or sleep issues as a cause of their breakup, or at least as a contributing factor to that breakup.
1/3.
Yeah.
Jesus.
That it's at least one of the factors. When you go then in and when you double click to say, okay, then what is it about this sleep kind of tension between the two of you? One of those things is a mismatch in chronotype. And you can see this when, people, I think this, on dating profiles now, someone was telling me, people will even say like, I'm a morning type or I'm an evening type, as if you're stating up front, this is part of my identity and just FYI, be forewarned, because maybe it's been an issue for them in the past. This is why I often speak about the notion of what's called a sleep divorce to prevent a real one. Now, it's not for everyone. A sleep divorce is where you sleep in separate locations. And when we've surveyed people, both from the Sleep Council in the United Kingdom and also the National Sleep Foundation here in America, the data is about the same. 1 in 4 people will say that they sleep in different locations with their partner. So almost a quarter of people in relationships will sleep in different locations. We think it's potentially an underestimate because if you survey people anonymously, then a third of them will report waking up at least in a different location the next morning. And part of the reason that it's a taboo is because people think, well, if we're not sleeping together, then we're not sleeping together. The exact opposite is true, that when a couple is sleeping well, we know that the sex hormones are improved, testosterone in men, estrogen, and luteinizing hormone in women. We also know that your desire to be intimate with your partner is increased. What we found is that for an hour of extra sleep, if a woman gets an hour of extra sleep, her libido desire to be intimate with her partner increases by 14%. Now, to give you some context, the FDA drugs for improving or increasing libido in women, drugs such as Vyleesi here, clinical drugs, they will increase it by about 24%. And that's a pharmacological agent. But here, just the added non-pharmacological benefit of 1 hour of extra sleep will get you more than 50% of the way there. So I want to just remove that notion of the stigma of that if you're not sleeping together, you're not sleeping. It's usually quite the opposite. I would say that part of the challenge, though, is that if we look at all objective measures, if I measure your sleep and the sleep of your wife, when you're sleeping separately versus when you're sleeping together, it's very likely that objectively you will both be sleeping worse when you're sleeping together. That's what the science tells us. However, what's interesting is that when you survey people and say, how satisfied are you with your sleep, which is a subjective measure, people will say, I'm actually more satisfied with my sleep when I'm with my partner than when I'm sleeping alone. So there's a mismatch here. Objectively, your sleep is better, but subjectively, you still prefer that. And of course, it's natural. There is safety, there's security in co-sleeping. There is this sort of connection that we get, you can approach it if you want. Just be honest with yourself and be honest with your partner. And you can start by saying, look, this isn't forever. I just want to say, let's do an experiment for a week, for 10 days. Let's just try it and see how it goes. It doesn't need to be permanent, because what you actually miss are the bookends of sleep. For the most part, the two of you are not conscious for most of the experience of sleeping together. It's really getting into bed and sort of having a kiss or a cuddle, and sort of waking up together in the morning and sort of, now obviously when you're mismatched chronotype, that's also, it can be a challenge too. So you can still have a sleep divorce, but you can set up a system where you will go in and you'll say your good nights and you'll kind of get into bed, have a kiss and cuddle, and then you retreat to a separate location. And you can repeat that same process. So I don't want to sort of belabor the point of a sleep divorce, but people can certainly explore. There is something called a halfway house, which is called the Scandinavian method, which sounds far more salacious than it actually is. It's simply that you buy two beds and you put them side by side in the same room, and therefore the amount of disruption, physical disruption that happens by way of sheets and movement is decreased. But that doesn't solve it all. Sometimes there is snoring, sometimes there is sleep talking. Those things are not obviated by the Scandinavian method.
So all of this stuff we say to ourselves, because I say that to myself all the time. I've told myself I'm a night owl.
Yeah.
And I've given myself the whole chronotype spiel.
Yeah.
That's BS.
Yeah. In my opinion, the way I interpret the literature, it seems that, you know, the variability that I think is talked about, or how we think about it as a society, in terms of there's chronotypes that are, you know, very, you know, you fall asleep, you're genetically predisposed to fall asleep at 1 a.m. and I'm genetically predisposed to fall asleep at 9 p.m. Yeah, I don't think it's that kind of variability. I think the variability maybe is an hour at the most, maybe an hour and a half. Obviously, it's age related as well. But for the most part, I don't think this variability is as pronounced as what we say it is.
Sleep.
Yeah.
So conventional wisdom says it's all about how many hours you spend sleeping.
Mm-hmm. This has already been shown to be not true. Sleep duration is important, right? We can put a pin in that. But sleep regularity predicts all-cause mortality. And this is just recently published, actually, not by my team, but looking at, it was actually UK Biobank, 60,000 people, 10 million sleeps, objective measure of sleep. And they found that sleep regularity predicted mortality and independent of sleep duration. So it's not to say that sleep duration doesn't matter, but that is absolutely incomplete advice. How much time you spend in bed doesn't necessarily predict how long you live. It is the degree to which you stabilize when you go to bed and when you wake up that predicts mortality.
What did they find? What was the conclusion of that? Was there a sort of a percentage variance in those that have irregular and regular sleep?
Yeah, so the sleep onset offset times, I'm not sure, but actually this is research that my team is doing and that we have not published yet. So this is preliminary data, but we're actually able to determine down to the minute what is a tolerable level of variability. So for the most elite athletes on the planet, the 0.001%, 18 to 23-year-olds, we know that 70 minutes of onset offset variability. At 70 minutes, we will see a sharp decline in markers of recovery, heart rate variability, resting heart rate, which is a indicator of how you will adapt to load the next day.
To stress the next day.
So
Okay.
life load. So sleep wake time is really important. And we're doing research across every age bucket. But you can imagine that if these are the most robust humans on the planet and they have 70 minutes of variability that is tolerable. Within that population, some are a little bit sooner in terms of can deal with less variability, and others can deal with slightly more variability, but the mean is 70 minutes. So you can imagine for individuals who are more vulnerable, who are less robust physically, mentally, emotionally, their tolerable level is going to be much narrower.
One of the problems I also have when I sleep sometimes is I hear people say you can't eat like 3 or 4 hours before bed. However, I sometimes get home at 10 p.m. and I get home hungry as hell at 10 p.m.
Yeah.
And then sometimes if I order food, for example, it might come at like 11,
Okay.
which means that I end up eating at 11. And then I really see it in my sleep scores. I think as well that I'm someone that tends to fall asleep later. Again, this might just be me telling BS to myself, but that's what tends to happen. And I know I'm not supposed to eat before bed, but I'm so hungry. So is there anything that I can eat before bed that won't disrupt my sleep, but will get rid of the hunger?
Yes, the preference is not to have a huge meal right before bed that's fried, fatty, really heavy sitting in your stomach. That hour right before bedtime. So if you're able to time that and be strategic, then that's obviously the preference. But I'm okay with you having a pre-sleep snack. A lot of times for my athletes, that means we'll go for something like 50% of a complex carb and like 50% of a lean protein. So for example, cereal and milk is an easy one.
Cereal?
Yes, cereal and milk. Of course, we want something that's whole grain and not, necessarily a sugary, cereal, but cereal and milk is an easy one that's many people have access to, or cottage cheese and fruit, or 100% whole wheat crackers and peanut butter. And the reason why is because I don't want you waking up in the middle of the night being hungry, or even trying to fall asleep and you feel like you're hungry. But we want something that's slow digesting through the night, because ideally you're going to be sleeping 7, 8, 9 hours during the night. And we want it to be able to get you to the morning time, and then you will fuel when you wake up. So a pre-sleep snack can be a great strategy if you're coming home late and you want to obviously be able to fuel before bed, or if you have a really early dinner and you're hungry before bedtime.
Yeah, that happens sometimes as well. Sometimes I'll eat dinner at about 5 p.m.
Yep.
And then I get to about 10, 11 p.m. and I'm still awake and I'm starving.
Okay, so what's a pre-sleep snack that you think you can grab for?
Some nuts.
Okay, yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah. Nuts have protein in them. You can grab a good nut mix. Maybe you can partner that also with like some yogurt too.
Raspberries.
Yeah,
Blackberries.
fruit. Yeah, and some, a protein and carb in there. And those are good pre-sleep snack.
If I wanted to destroy my sleep, what would you recommend I eat right before bed? What would you recommend I consume right before bed?
If you just want to destroy your sleep entirely. Okay, so we're going to have the nightcap of having a couple of drinks right before bed.
Okay, so some alcohol.
Yeah, we'll have some alcohol on board. We'll throw in some caffeine too to really get you to stay awake in the next couple of hours. We'll add a really heavy meal that's fried, tomato-based, fatty, sitting in your stomach right before bed. And
did you say tomato-based?
Yeah, sometimes individuals will have acid reflux with tomato-based products, and so if that's something that is that something that you experience, then you generally want to avoid some of the tomato-based products that can aggravate some of the acid reflux.
So some fried food with some ketchup.
Yes.
Okay, so alcohol, caffeine, and some fried food with some ketchup.
I think that would really work to your disadvantage during the nighttime.
Any sugar?
Yes, sugary carbs tends to be some of the preferences when you're particularly also sleep deprived. Mm-hmm. So people will choose more carb heavy foods and foods that have less fiber and more sugar.
Why
fats.
Is it that if I eat those foods before bed, it impacts my sleep? What's going on?
I don't think we have a great understanding of that. I think the field of sleep and nutrition is definitely growing. And I think down the road in the next 5 or 10 years, we hopefully will have more answers to that. But it's a fascinating area that we do start to understand what we eat can affect our sleep. So for example, the stages of our sleep or how we sleep during the nighttime. Some of the smaller studies have shown what you eat can then affect having more awakenings during the nighttime and affecting the quality of your sleep. But I think many of them are still at the infancy.
I've noticed something recently, because recently I've had to get up quite early on a few occasions. So when I say early, I mean I've had to wake up at 4 a.m. because I've got a flight at 6 a.m. And really interestingly, if I got in bed at like 11 p.m. at night and I have to wake up at say 3 or 4 a.m., when I wake up at 3 or 4 a.m., I'm really hungry. But if I wake up at 8 a.m., I'm not hungry.
Well, you are starting your day much earlier. So your body clock is starting at a much earlier time than you typically would versus 8 o'clock. So you almost have what we call socially jet lagged yourself, right? Where you didn't get on an airplane yet, but you literally shifted your whole sleep schedule to be an earlier wake up time. And so you can feel some of the symptoms of jet lag, where you can have stomach GI upset, you can feel more fatigued, you can have those symptoms as if you got onto a new time zone and flew there, but you hadn't yet.
It almost feels, dare I say, like hormonal, because I was trying to understand what hunger is, and hunger is essentially a bunch of hormones, isn't it?
So yes, you have certain hormones that regulate your appetite. So leptin and ghrelin are two hormones that impact your appetite. Ghrelin makes you more hungry. Leptin feels more satiated. If you don't get sufficient sleep, these levels can be imbalanced. And so that's where people tend to, as we've talked about, gravitate towards, carb and unhealthy foods in the later evening time. But also when these are not well balanced, that can also lead to weight gain or situations where you're not able to potentially regulate your weight appropriately. And so when I have individuals who are wondering about not making weight goals, I ask them about their sleep, and they don't recognize that sometimes being able to address how they sleep will actually help them to get to the weight management goals that they're really striving for.
What do I need to know about when I should be eating, what I should be eating, and the implications that has on my circadian rhythm, my body clocks?
Yeah, so it's in the literature. There's time restricted eating and there's time restricted feeding. And time restricted feeding generally, if you're reading the literature, is going to refer to mouse models. Time restricted eating will refer to human studies.
Mouse models being studies they did with mice.
Yeah, sorry. Mice studies done with mice are just time restricted feeding, and humans would be time restricted eating. And not to confuse this with intermittent fasting, which I know is a hot topic and people love talking about it. Time restricted eating basically has a circadian component. So it's really about the timing of when you're eating your food in relation to the light dark cycle. Intermittent fasting is basically just reducing calories. And so time restricted eating does not have a calorie component to it. It's more about the timing. And there's been a lot of interesting studies that have been done that show if you eat, within kind of 8 to 12 hour window, you will have much better metabolic outcomes. And this is well established. And if we see in the Whoop data that if you stop eating 3 hours prior to when you sleep, to when you fall asleep, markers of sleep and recovery are exponentially better. So timing of meals really does matter. And there's no question that, and we know this from other research, you're more primed to metabolize food closer to when you wake up in the morning. So earlier in the day, you're going to be much more primed to utilize the nutrients that you've digested.
So does that mean we should have sort of an earlier eating window?
Yes.
Brian Johnson.
Of course. Yeah. I know he stops eating at 11 a.m.
Which is crazy.
Which is insane and not super practical. But I think if you can stop eating around when the sun sets, you'll position yourself to improve your metabolic health. And I would go so far to say that, regardless of what it is you're eating, because a lot of folks cannot afford to, eat high quality food. That's just a reality. And a lot of those folks do suffer from at higher rates of cardiometabolic dysfunction. But if we can just consolidate our eating window to 8 to 10 hours, we get ourselves like 60% of the way to our kind of metabolic goals. Again, it's not to say that content and quality does not matter. It absolutely does. But if we can't focus on that for whatever it might be, consolidating our eating window, so eating every single one of our calories between, an 8 to 12 hour window, we will improve our health.
And what's your eating window?
So I do about 10 hours.
Okay.
Yeah. So I pretty much don't eat after the sun goes down.
When you say the sun goes down?
Sunsets. Yeah.
Is that like 5 p.m.?
I mean, now it's early. Yeah. Right. So I give myself like an hour
PM.
window. Yeah. Like right now it's definitely early, but for the most part, I can kind of get away with it based on my lifestyle.
So ideally between sort of 7 a.m. and 4 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
And then just make sure you're not eating, 2 to 3 hours before you fall asleep.
Yes. That's the big key, I think, is you want a nice big buffer between, when you have your last calorie and when you go to sleep. Because they're both, so digestion is a parasympathetic activity.
What does that
mean?
So
that means, your autonomic nervous system has two branches, your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. Your parasympathetic is your rest and digest, right? We also want to be in a parasympathetic state when we're sleeping. So when we are digesting food, we're basically kind of confusing our system in terms of where it should apply its resources, right? So it basically diverts resources away from, the sleep and the restoration. And that's what, if you have a big meal, you'll notice your heart rate is a lot higher, right? And your stress score is higher, right? Some of the features on the Whoop app. And when you are not having to digest, you'll see your stress score is lower. You'll see your heart rate is lower. Your heart rate variability would be higher in those situations. We want to make sure that when we're sleeping, we are not diverting any resources away from sleep. I mean, alcohol is another one, right? Like to metabolize alcohol, you're diverting, significant resources away from the regeneration and the recovery that needs to happen during sleep by bouncing you out of deeper stages of sleep. So the same sort of effect happens with food. And we see this, at population levels on the Whoop app. It's just very apparent that meal timing and alcohol are really the two biggest disruptors to a good night's sleep.
So interesting, because I've always wondered, there was a time in my life where I routinely ate super late at night because I would work very, very hard during the day. I would basically forget to eat. I'd get home at maybe 9 or 10 at night. I would then order the food at 9 or 10, which means it comes at 11 or 12. Yeah. And then I'd eat at 11 or 12.
Yeah. It's very stressful for your system.
Yeah. Tell me about it. The interesting thing that I started to notice was when I did that, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered why. So I arrived at the same sort of self-constructed conclusion that if I put food into my body at midnight, it basically keeps my body on for a couple of hours.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a perfect way to describe it.
I would see exactly that in the Whoop data, which is I would see that my heart rate went up to about 70 beats per minute for the first 3 hours. It was almost like my body was still walking around or something was going on. And then 3 or 4 hours in, it would start to fall again back to, 45,
you've metabolized
50.
the food. Yeah. And we know, there's a really nice study that looked at basically everyone is eating the exact same meals, and they're relatively the same age. Like there's a really beautiful design. And they basically looked at folks who are eating after 3 p.m. and folks who are eating before 3 p.m. And the folks who ate a bulk of their calories before 3 p.m. had significantly better metabolic outcomes and lost more weight. So again, there's no calorie restriction component here. They're all kind of eating similar diet, similar macronutrient distribution, similar calorie content. And it's the folks who were eating a bulk of their calories prior to 3 p.m. who had the best outcomes.
I had a cookie before bed because I'm bloody, I blame the hotel. I don't really blame the hotel. I take full responsibility. It was in the minibar and I hadn't eaten all day. I came back, I've been working all day. And when I've been working a lot, I'm much more likely to reach for something bad. And I had this cookie and honestly, I woke up the next morning, 8 hours later, feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I just felt so tired. And I know it was that bloody cookie because I looked at my my Whoop, #ad, #investor, and I could see that my heart rate throughout the night was really high, like atypically high. My heart rate throughout the night will usually just be this nice flat, 55 beats per minute. And when I'd had that cookie, it started and pretty much stayed for the first 3 or 4 hours at about 75 beats. So it was like my body was still on. It was like I was walking. And so I've always just had this idea that if you eat something like that right before bed, like puts your body under a lot of strain, like metabolic strain, then it's kind of like your body doesn't fall asleep. And my REM sleep's always attacked as well if I were to eat something like that.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I think we're starting to understand the connection of what we eat, how our gut is responding to that, and then how that potentially can affect your sleep and then ultimately your daytime functioning the next day. But we do recognize from sleep deprivation studies that individuals will make different nutritional choices and grab for the cookies and the ice cream and some of those other snacks later at night than they would if they were well rested.
That's a real horrible paradox, isn't it?
It is.
Do you know what I mean? Like if you're tired, then you're going to eat bad things right before bed, which is going to make you sleep worse and make you tired, which is going to mean you eat bad things before bed. It's this vicious cycle.
It is. And unfortunately, that could potentially lead to potential weight gain and other downstream consequences. So just one other reason why, obviously, making sure you're having sufficient sleep, but also having good practices and your approach to sleep is also a priority. So you're asking, what else did we do with Andre? But in that ways of preparing to sleep, we addressed, does he have a wind down routine? So we implemented one where he would read before bed to actually relax and prepare his brain and body to sleep for the night. Managing a racing mind can be incredibly common for not just the elite athlete, but for all of us. And so even before he did that reading, we'd actually have him stretch and process his thoughts outside of bed. And that set him up with a 2-part system so that he could actually be strategic about preparing to sleep for the night.
I was reading some research from the Sleep Foundation, and it says that a 2007 study with 29 young adults found that moderate doses of alcohol up to 1 hour before bedtime reduced melatonin production by nearly 20%. That's the study on alcohol and melatonin in young adults. A 2018 study of 4,908 Finnish participants found that sleep quality was reduced by 9.3% after 1 glass of wine, and by 24% after 2 glasses of wine, and by almost 40%, 39.2%, after 3 or more glasses of wine, or an equivalent amount of alcohol.
Yeah.
Which is really, really staggering that your sleep quality could dip 40% after 3 glasses of wine.
Oh, yeah. We just finished this analysis actually looking at alcohol and markers of recovery, so heart rate variability and heart rate. And literally with every drink, there's a linear relationship in the decline, and it is significant. We're talking even one drink will produce clinically significant reductions in heart rate and heart rate variability.
Is there such a thing as such a small dose of alcohol that it doesn't matter, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it depends on who you are. And I think there's a lot of individual variability there as well. I know resveratrol is something that's talked about a lot, and there's, I suppose there's in wine and grapes, there's resveratrol, and that's been linked to enhanced health and well-being. But I think you'd have to drink like 10 bottles or something to get the amount of resveratrol to actually make a, to make a dent. I don't think that's the argument. So yeah, I don't know that really any amount of alcohol is going to be helpful. And we know from the literature that just 1 to 2 drinks per week can have negative implications on health. So it's actually, I don't know that even a moderate amount of alcohol is good for you.
What's the implications for our circadian rhythms that we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's mainly because it impacts sleep. It's going to impact when you go to bed and when you wake up. So I think that's the biggest impact. And I think again, when we go back to melatonin, it's when you're disrupting that sleep onset offset, that's going to obviously have all the downstream negative effects that we've already spoken about. So I suppose if we're drinking, we're staying out later, so we're exposing ourselves to light. So yeah, there's lots of, we're going to be eating later. There's other behaviors that accompany drinking that kind of, pile on the negative effects.
Alcohol, health, circadian rhythms. What's your perspective on all of this?
Well, I like to think about it. I love this, the principle of non-neutrality, right? And this is how I like to think about behaviors, and how I've kind of always thought about it is if you've got a series of behaviors. We talked a lot about sleep, and physiological things, and you've got the psychological things, and they're either going to support your values, kind of who you want to be in this world, or they're not. And I think that's the lens with which I look at alcohol. In what way is this supporting my values of growth and impact and presence and compassion and tolerance, the things that are like core to who I want to be in this world. And I think when you look at it through that lens, the choices become really clear to me. If you're honest with yourself and you have some degree of self-awareness, understand what you care about, I think choices become a lot clearer. Like there's way, way more clarity about how to live your life in the micro, which is really what we're talking about. These just mini choices throughout the day. Does it support who you want to be in the world, or does it not? And there's very little gray, actually. And the gray are excuses in my view. And we can rationalize and make stuff up, all day long, right? To make ourselves feel better. But when you can step back from all of that and look at it really, taking yourself kind of out of the equation and look at it from a very objective standpoint, I think a choice like alcohol becomes very clear.
But it helps me to socialize, Kristen.
Yeah, if you need alcohol to bond or to, form a connection, there's probably something else going on that is unaddressed, and from my perspective.
Caffeine. Surely there's a correlation between the circadian disruption and
Yeah,
caffeine.
so that's definitely one of the circadian, it definitely can disrupt circadian rhythms if we're having caffeine, within 8 to 12 hours, I would say, of when we intend to sleep. It's going to impact our sleep onset, of course. And even if we're all, tired enough where we have, we're sleep deprived, we might fall asleep, but it will invariably end up disrupting or fragmenting our sleep. So we're not kind of getting into that deeper stages of sleep. We're not achieving the sleep quality that is going to allow us to wake up feeling restored and refreshed. So timing of caffeine is really important.
All of this conversation makes me have a huge amount of empathy for shift workers.
Oh.
And when I say shift workers, I don't mean people working, warehouses. I mean doctors, nurses, firefighters,
Mm-hmm.
the police, truck drivers, people that are baking.
Yeah, anyone who's up between the hours of, for more than 2 hours, between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. is considered a shift worker. So there's a lot of individuals walking around who are shift workers, but people who are, literally up during the biological night, it's a huge sacrifice. We know those folks on average are going to die 15 years sooner. It is, shift work is considered a carcinogen by the World Health Organization. It's, shift work is, those folks make an enormous sacrifice.
They're going to die 15 years sooner?
On average.
I mean, that's terrifying.
I know.
Is anybody trying to solve for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the work that I do is looking at shift work, trying to understand, what other levers, can we deploy to offset some of the impact of being awake during the biological night. And, time restricted eating is a lever, really thinking about when we're eating protein, when we're viewing light, what's the cadence of on off, so we minimize the disruption to circadian rhythms. I mean, the fact is, like, the roster size at these hospitals are just simply not big enough to be able to, I think, deploy schedules that mitigate some of the risk associated with this disrupted circadian rhythm. But it is frightening, and there is a lot of work to try to understand how we can mitigate some of the negative effects. But it's a tough problem to solve.
It's not just that those individuals will die, on average 15 years earlier, but their quality of life, I imagine, won't be as good, because if they're not sleeping,
yeah, I mean, mood,
consistently,
depression,
yeah,
suicide. I mean, it's higher, for folks in these professions, who are having to operate counter to the naturally dark cycle.
So let's talk about that then. Mental health, depression, suicidality. What's the correlation there between?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting research. I mean, one is just, we talk about just the layperson. So getting outside of shift work, we come back to shift work. If you look at this, most folks experience social jet lag, right? Which is basically characterized as, a big difference between our weekday sleep schedule and our weekend sleep schedule, right? So pretty much anyone, between 20 to 30 probably is, kind of falls into this bucket of having social jet lag. But one of the things that a research study we saw looking at specifically at social jet lag in college students, they saw that for every hour of variability between weekday and weekend schedules, they saw a 17% increase in non-suicidal ideation. So these folks aren't committing suicide, but they're fantasizing about committing suicide. And that increases 17%. And this was more pronounced in individuals who were already vulnerable. So kind of coming back to circadian disruption being present in 100% of mental health issues, we can see where shift workers would be extremely vulnerable, right, to mental health issues, given that their variability, and we look at the WHOOP data, it's basically random in terms of looking at their sleep-wake time. It's so variable that it's like we can't even see a pattern. It's random, which is frightening.
Why is that frightening?
Well, because, the more variability you have, like the more psychological and physiological, negative consequences there'll be.
So I am not a caffeine drinker myself, but I am pro coffee.
Oh, okay.
And I'll tell you why I'm very thoughtful about my wording between caffeine and coffee there. And to your point, it's another astute one, which is, is it a miracle drug with no cost? In biology and medicine, there is almost no free lunch. And that is true when it comes to caffeine and sleep. So perhaps I'll give the skinny on caffeine and how it impacts your sleep, but then circle back around to what seems an oxymoronic statement for me, which is why I'm still pro coffee. Caffeine will hurt your sleep in probably at least 3 ways, some of which most people are not aware of. The first issue is the duration of its action. So caffeine has what we call a half-life of about 5 to 6 hours. In other words, after about 5 to 6 hours, half of that caffeine is still in your system. What that means is that caffeine has a quarter life of somewhere between 10 to 12 hours. So if you have a cup of coffee at noon, at midday, a quarter of that caffeine is still in your brain at midnight. So having a cup of coffee at noon, and it's hyperbole in truth, probably, or it's a little bit hyperbolic, but it's almost the equivalent of a coffee at noon is the equivalent of, tucking yourself into bed, and just before you turn the light out, you swig a quarter of a cup of coffee and you hope for a good night of sleep, and it's probably not going to happen. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is the timing of caffeine. The second is that caffeine is a stimulant. Now, everyone knows this. Everyone knows that caffeine can make you more alert and more awake. By the way, how does it do that? It comes back to adenosine, which is the chemical that we spoke about, the sleepiness chemical. It's no coincidence that those two things sound the same at the end of the name, caffeine and adenosine. Caffeine will actually race into your brain, and it will latch on to the adenosine receptors, the welcome sites in your brain. And it has very sharp elbows, and it will force away the adenosine from those receptors, and it will hijack those receptors. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, well, hang on a second. If it's latching onto those sleepiness chemical receptors, shouldn't caffeine make you more sleepy? And the answer is no, because what it does is it just latches onto the receptor and it inactivates it, essentially. So it masks the receptor. What caffeine does then is race into your brain. You've got all of this sleepiness at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. You have an espresso because you're trying to power through and finish the report, or the presentation for your your pitch for your deck for your startup company. And that caffeine races in, it latches onto the adenosine receptors and blocks the signal of adenosine. So now your brain was thinking, I'm starting to get tired, it's 10 p.m. But now all of a sudden that signal is blocked. And caffeine is like hitting the mute button on your television remote controller. It just mutes the signal of sleepiness. So now you think, well, no, I don't feel sleepy anymore. And here's the danger, that even though, when the caffeine is in your system and it's latched onto the receptors, that adenosine is still there. It's not going away. In fact, if anything, during the course of the caffeine in your system, it continues to build and build. And now when the caffeine finally gets metabolized and excreted out of your system, not only do you go back to the sleepiness that you had many hours before, it's that plus all of the adenosine sleepiness that's been building up during that time in between. So you get hit with this huge tsunami wave of sleepiness, and that's what we call the caffeine crash. So one of the issues, so that's sort of caffeine in terms of how it works in its timing. Another issue is that it creates anxiety, just as you said. And anxiety is probably one of the greatest enemies of sleep. It's one of the principal reasons that underlies insomnia is a physiological state of anxiety, that your fight or flight branch of the nervous system is ratcheted up. That's what caffeine will do. It needs to do the opposite for you to fall asleep. That's why you can have what we call the tired but wired phenomenon, where you say, I'm so desperately tired. I am so tired, but I'm just so wired that I can't fall asleep. It's because your nervous system is too amped up. Caffeine will trigger that amping up. Then at that point, if you're struggling to fall asleep because you've got too much caffeine on board, it is what we call anxiogenic. So now you start to worry. And the last thing you need to do when your head hits the pillow for good sleep is worry. Because when you start to worry, you start to ruminate. And when you ruminate, you catastrophize. And when you catastrophize, you're dead in the water for the next 2 hours when it comes to sleep. Because we have this sense that, things at night, in the darkness of night, are so much bigger than they are in the brightness of day. And we start worrying, in this modern era, we're constantly on reception. And very rarely do we do reflection. And unfortunately, the only time when we typically do reflection is when we turn off the light and our head hits the pillow. And that is the last time you want to be doing reflection. So that's the second problem with caffeine. It's anxiogenic, and it only makes you sort of almost like the Woody Allen neurotic of the sleep world. The final part of caffeine is that it's very good at blocking your deep sleep. So we've done a number of these studies where we'll give people a standard dose of caffeine, let's say 150 milligrams, 200 milligrams, which is probably, a cup and a half of good, strong coffee. And then we put you to bed and we look at the amount of deep sleep. And it will strip away your deep sleep by about somewhere between 15 to 30%. Now, to put that in context, to drop your deep sleep by 30%, I'd probably have to age you by about 40 years, 40. Or you could do it every night with an espresso with dinner. And that's one of the problems that people will say to me, look, I'm one of those people who I can have 2 espressos with dinner and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep. So no harm, no foul. Well, not necessarily, because even if you fall asleep and you stay asleep, you're not aware of the lack of the deep sleep that you're not getting because of the caffeine. And so now you wake up the next day and you think, well, I don't remember having a hard time falling asleep. I don't remember waking up, but now I'm reaching for 2 or 3 cups of coffee the next morning rather than my standard 1 cup of coffee because I don't feel refreshed and restored by my sleep because I was lacking the amount of deep sleep.
And deep sleep, what does that rob us of? The lack of deep sleep?
So lack of deep sleep is critical for regulating your cardiovascular system. It's the time when we do replenish the immune system. It also regulates your metabolic system. So it controls the hormones such as insulin that will regulate your blood sugar, and you will become blood sugar dysregulated without sufficient deep sleep. Upstairs in the brain, deep sleep will strengthen and consolidate and secure new memories into your brain. They will prevent those memories from being forgotten. Deep sleep is also the time when we cleanse the brain of metabolic toxins, particularly the toxins that are related to Alzheimer's disease. So getting a lack of deep sleep is, I would say, a non-trivial thing in that regard. But I don't want to be also puritanical here, and this is where I'm going to change my title tune. I am not here to tell anyone how to live their life. I have no right to tell anyone how to live their life. I'm just a scientist. All I want to try and do is gift you the science and the knowledge of sleep so that you can make an informed choice. And after all, and the same is true for alcohol too and sleep, life is to be lived to a certain degree. No one wants to be the healthiest guy in the graveyard. I don't want to be that way too. I want to live life just with moderation. The reason I don't drink caffeine is not because I'm so puritanical. I want to be the poster child of good sleep. I love the smell of freshly ground coffee in the morning. And it's a great ritual. It's just that I've run my genetics and I am one of the slow caffeine metabolizers. So you can do these genetic kits online and they will tell you, are you a slow metabolizer or a fast metabolizer? So that's the variability. That's why some people say, look, I'm pretty immune to caffeine. Others will say, no, I'm not. Why do I now favor coffee? I was actually quite anti-caffeine in coffee when I first came out with the book, just looking at the studies. But now the data is immensely compelling. The health benefits associated with coffee are undeniable. Study after study after study. And we can put them all together in this big, what we call a meta-analysis study. And it is so strikingly clear that drinking coffee is a good thing for you from a health perspective. 2 things to say about that. The first is that it's got nothing to do with the caffeine. And a lot of people have sort of rightly challenged me to say, look, you say how problematic sleep can be when you're drinking too much caffeine. But yet coffee is associated with many of the same health benefits that sleep is associated with. But coffee is supposed to hurt your sleep. How do you reconcile those two, Matt Walker? And the answer is very simple. Antioxidants. Because it turns out that the coffee bean contains a whopping dose of antioxidants. Things such as it's got other things such as caffeine, but it's got a bunch of incredible antioxidants. Probably the most powerful of them in terms of the coffee bean is something called chlorogenic acid. Now, don't worry, it's not chlorine, it's not chloride, it's not bleach. Chlorogenic acid is very different. And what's happened in the modern world is that we, on we have and struggle with our diet so much because we don't eat enough whole foods, etc. So what's happened is that the coffee bean has been now asked to carry the Herculean weight of all of our antioxidant needs on its shoulders. And where most people get the majority of their antioxidants is by way of drinking coffee. That's why coffee is associated with so many health benefits. And it's not the caffeine. Case in point, if you look at the studies with decaffeinated coffee, you get very similar health benefits. Again, it's not the caffeine, it's the coffee itself. So the bottom line here is drink coffee, but I would say the dose and the timing make the poison. So try to limit yourself to about 2 cups of coffee, 3 cups of coffee maximum. Because if you look at the health benefits, by the way, it's a dose, it's not a dose response where it's linear, where the more and more coffee you drink, the more and more healthy you become. It peaks at about 2 to 3 and then actually starts to go down in the opposite direction for lots of reasons that we can speak about. So dose and the timing make the poison when it comes to coffee.
So you drink decaf?
So I do drink decaf. So I will drink coffee just because I love the smell and I do enjoy the taste of it, but I drink decaffeinated coffee. I would love to drink caffeinated coffee too, because I'm sure it would be interesting because I work out every day and I work out every morning, and so many of the health coaches that I speak with and health professionals say, you should definitely get a shot of caffeine in it and boost your workout. And actually the data on that is pretty clear too, that your lifting, for example, in the gym and your metabolic activity is stronger when you've had pre-caffeine doses.
But it's also stronger when you sleep. So.
But exactly, and that's the problem. So, and sleep is, I would argue, much more beneficial to health. And if you're trying to work out or you're trying to be an athlete or perform, sleep will trump caffeine 5 ways till Tuesday. I mean, sleep is probably the very best legal performance enhancing drug that we know of that not enough athletes are abusing.
Sorry?
Sleeping medication?
Okay. So some medications can be helpful, like melatonin, particularly if you're trying to advance your clock, has evidence that it can help shift that a little bit more quickly when you're trying to advance your clock earlier.
Would you recommend it to athletes?
I would say if it's something that you've used before and you know that you don't experience some of the side effects, it could be a useful tool. So melatonin, while it's one of the most commonly used supplements and sleep aids, there are still side effects that to be wary of. So specifically for athletes too, you can feel more groggy and sluggish when you wake up from it. It's not regulated by the FDA here in the US, and so you don't always know what's actually in those supplements. So for my elite athletes, they use what's called NSF Sport certified versions. There's more regulation around them. But for the everyday person, there's a study where they looked at the amount of melatonin that was actually in a variety of these supplements, and it was a wide range from over 400% of what was on the label to obviously under 100% of what they actually indicated. So there's a wide range of what's actually going to be in the supplement, but it can help, particularly when you're on travel, with reacclimating.
One of the other sort of ongoing stereotypes that I've always wondered if it was wrong or right or whatever, now I get a chance to ask you, is about this culture of sleep medication. So I've got some friends who might have, prescribed sleep medication, but I've got a lot of friends also that use what they call sort of natural, they always use the word natural something, so it's like natural sleep tablets.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on this culture of humans taking sleep tablets to get them to feel sleepy and go off to sleep at night?
Usually when people ask me that question, personally, the first thing I ask them is, why is it that you think you're not able to sleep? And try to reverse engineer the question from there. Before we even start thinking about sticking band-aids on wounds, I firstly want to ask what's causing the infection, because we can keep bandaging it for all we like, but if it keeps festering, it's probably not going to go away anytime soon.
Is it a problem to keep bandaging it?
It is a problem. Right now, we don't typically advocate sleeping pills as the first-line defense agent against or for insomnia as a treatment. In fact, in 2016, the American College, and again, this is me simply describing the science. This is me being descriptive of the science, not prescriptive in terms of medicine, because I'm not a medical doctor. But in 2016, the American College of Physicians, they had an expert panel who surveyed all of the literature on classic sleeping pills. And what they suggested was that sleeping pills must no longer be the first-line treatment for insomnia. It has to be cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or what we call CBTI, which is a psychological intervention that we can speak about. But their recommendation was that they found, I think their wording was small and of questionable clinical importance in terms of the benefits of sleeping pills. Now, there is a time and a place in clinical medicine for sleeping pills, but usually as an adjunct in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy. They are not advocated for long-term use, so they're usually advocated for short-term use, weeks. Most people have been on them for months, if not years, these classic sleeping pills. And that's a problem because those sleeping pills are in a class of drugs that we call the sedative hypnotics. And sedation is not sleep. For some subset of some people, there are some of these quote unquote sleep supplements that may benefit. But overall, the studies are very clear. None of them are efficacious. And when you think about it, it makes sense. If there was some cheap sleep supplement that you could buy on Amazon, that was the Shangri-La of good sleep, that was this miracle sleep drug, don't you think that a pharmaceutical company would have patented it 20 years ago and be making billions of dollars from it? That alone tells you all that you need to know about, these natural sleep supplements.
Exercise. One of the issues that I have sometimes in my life, today is one of those days where, because I was up very early this morning, it meant that I didn't go to the gym this morning, which means I'm probably going to get home after being in the studio, being at the office today at maybe 7, 8 p.m. And I'm super hungry then, usually, right? Yeah. And I also need to work out. So sometimes what happens is I choose to work out first, and then obviously it makes the meal late at night. But there's also days in my life where I end up working out, and I'm known for this, at like 11 or 12 p.m. at night.
Wow.
And there was this old train of thought that was a good thing to do, because people would say, oh, you're going to be tired when you get in bed. But that doesn't seem to be what happens.
Yeah. Do you feel more energized?
I feel more energized.
Yeah. Well, not surprising, right? Adrenaline, cortisol, like all of the kind of hormones and chemicals that you need to kind of get to a place where you can exert that energy are kind of flowing through the system, and it takes time for them to go back to normal levels. So to kind of get back to homeostasis is going to take some time. And so, yeah, I mean, it would make sense that you're, kind of activated after exercise. So for some folks, there is a lot of individual variability, I think, with exercise timing. Some people are impacted more, but I honestly think that it has more to do with the light. Usually if we're in a gym, it's generally well lit, right? You're not in a dark gym. So you're getting exposure to light, which is going to make you feel like more activated. And it's, again, telling your body that it's time to be awake and alert.
On that point of light, there's a school of thought that says you should look at lights when you wake up in the morning. My partner always gets up in the morning, walks out into the balcony and sits out there for 10 or 20 minutes in the morning.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yes, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, she's the best. It's so annoying. She gets everything right.
Oh, love it. Yeah, but for sure that you want to get light within, 100,000 lux is pretty much what you want to get within, 5 to 20 minutes of waking up to tell your body like it's time to go.
100,000 what?
Oh, lux. So just like photon energy. So pretty much if you're outside for 5 to 20 minutes, it sounds like your girlfriend is like nailing this protocol. You'll get all of the photon energy that you need to tell your system that it is time to be awake.
Can't you just go look into a lamp or something?
It will just take longer because it doesn't have the same light intensity. But if you're waking up, prior to when the sun gets up, turn all the lights. You want to try to mimic day as much as possible. And then once the sun does come up, it's good to get outside.
I think the stat said that reading before bed improved your sleep by about 5% across everyone that was using Whoop, which makes sense because you're going to be away from light, I guess, and you're also going to be calming you called it your parasympathetic nervous system.
Yes.
The parasympathetic nervous system, what do I need to know about that in the context of sleep?
That's just the system that helps you relax and wind down. It is in balance with the sympathetic system, which you may have heard as the fight or flight system that gets you going. That's where your heartbeat will be much more rapid. Your breathing can be much more rapid when you need to go.
That's when I'm overthinking.
Yes, but you want to dampen that down and you want to get your parasympathetic system activated so you can help actually relax physiologically your body and also your brain so that you're in a better state to sleep at night. Right? It's easier to slowly pump your brakes and then try to sleep versus if you were going 60 miles an hour on a freeway and then suddenly slamming on the brakes and just jumping into bed. So you actually have a process to slow yourself down, your brain and body. It will help prepare you to actually get better sleep during the nighttime.
What about when I shower or I bath? Because often I go and have a shower, then I get straight into bed after.
Yes.
Is that good or bad? I
would encourage you to shift that timing a little bit earlier into the night. So an hour and a half before you are planning to go to bed, I would shift your shower because when you are taking a hot bath or hot shower, it increases your core temperature. But when you fall asleep, your core temperature drops. So you don't want that competing signal to be right before bedtime. But if you back that shower up an hour and a half, that should be sufficient time that we think potentially there's an augmentation of helping that drop in temperature. And some smaller studies have shown that that can help decrease the time to fall asleep and also enhance deep sleep, which has implications for muscle recovery, regeneration, and you get more of that in the earlier part of your night. So it's an easy fix, just to tweak the timing of your shower and your hot bath to be just an hour or two before bedtime, not right before bed. So it's a strategy too, if you have difficulties winding down and relaxing, to implement that hot shower, hot bath earlier in the evening.
We said something earlier about exercising before bed. Now, if I have sex before bed and, it lasts a long time.
Yeah.
Is that not then going to produce a ton of adrenaline and wake me up again?
So it depends. If you ejaculate, then you will then release oxytocin, which is kind of a calming chemical. So guys typically, after they ejaculate, feel sleepy because of the release of oxytocin.
But then that goes back to my point about masturbation. Don't you release oxytocin when you masturbate?
Yeah, I think the oxytocin is about connection.
Okay.
Right. So that might be why we see these strong effects when you're having sex with a partner or a spouse. Is that you're getting this benefit of this beautiful connection with your partner and spouse, provided it goes well, and then you release this oxytocin, which is kind of makes you feel connected and safe, and so all of those, I think that kind of condition helps, I think, you fall asleep and potentially stay asleep.
It does make sense because I do get very, very tired after I've had sex with my partner, and I've always wondered why that is.
Yeah, and I don't know that women. It seems to have women want to maybe stay up and snuggle and talk a little bit more after sex. So, but guys, it seems, get sleepy and want to fall asleep.
Will sex improve or hurt my sleep? I'm thinking, because I'm really trying to get at, like, should you be in bed with someone? Does it improve your sleep to sleep with someone? And does sex have an impact on your sleep? Because speaking from personal experience, I think that if I have sex before bed, I sleep better.
I don't think that there's great literature on sleep and sex out there, but I will say that there has been, there's definitely an impact potentially of a bed partner sleeping with you in bed, because their movements can affect your sleep. If they snore, that can very much affect your waking up during the nighttime. And then, with sex, I think that is something anecdotally, some people will definitely say it helps them to be able to consolidate their sleep and they feel like the quality is better. But I don't think there's a lot of great studies that are being funded for research right now.
One of the things that popular in culture as well is this idea of doing 10,000 steps a day.
Yeah, now that's fun. That started because of a Japanese pedometer. But right before the Olympics were in Tokyo in the 60s, they had invented the pedometer, and they were sitting in a boardroom and they were discussing what to call the pedometer. And they picked, out of the blue, they picked 10,000 steps because that's apparently an auspicious number. And it sounded about right. There was no science behind it. Interestingly, it turns out it's pretty good. If you look at steps per day and health outcomes, your average hunter-gatherer walks between 10 to 18,000 steps, depends on male, female, etc. And if you look at steps per day and outcomes, about around 7 to 8,000 steps, the curve kind of bottoms out. Right? There doesn't seem to be a huge advantage to taking more than that per day in terms of large epidemiological studies. So it turns out to be not that bad a goal, but it's not a perfect number like a lot of things, right? It's just it's a reasonable goal to shoot for.
When you started writing this book about exercise and running and all these subject matters, was there any instant changes or any real lasting changes that you implemented into your own life from everything you learned? I think about that all the time with this podcast. I'll have a guest on, I'll have these mini eureka moments, and then something will stick. So I'm wondering, having studied all of these people all around the world and looked at their bodies and exercise and physical exertion, what have you taken into your own life that has stuck? I
would say that I've become more serious about doing some strength training. I've always loved walking and running and endurance kinds of activities, and I've always sort of hated doing weights. I just don't like it, and I'm a wimp. I'm not a very strong person, and people tend to do what they like, right? You get reinforcement from it, and the more I study the importance of resistance training and the more I study the importance of doing weights, especially as you age, the more I started kicking myself for being lazy about that. So now I try to do good 2 strength workouts out of every week at least, and take it more seriously, because especially as you age, loss of muscle mass can be really debilitating. There's the technical term for that is sarcopenia. Sarco is the Greek word for muscle, and penia is loss, of muscle loss. So as people get older, they tend to lose muscle, and when you do that, you become frail and you lose functional capacity, and then that starts off a vicious cycle, right? Once that happens, then you're less likely to be physically active, and then of course when you're less physically active, your muscles begin to waste away more, and it's very debilitating. And so I think as we get older, and I'm getting older, it's more and more important, to kind of incorporate that. So I think that's the one thing that I've taken to heart.
Yeah, from what you said there, it sounds like not doing resistance training, not lifting weights as you age, almost accelerates aging in any sort of superficial sense. But it also, in a physiological sense, you're increasing the speed of aging.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I think about it that way, but I think I kind of reverse it slightly, which is that aging is just the clock ticking on, right? There's nothing we can do about age, but senescence is the way our bodies degrade as we get older. And what physical activity does, actually maybe the most important thing about physical activity, is that it slows senescence, especially for certain organs and systems. And there are different kinds of physical activities. So there's endurance physical activities, like running, walking, etc., swimming, and then strength or resistance physical activities. And they have different kinds of ways in which they slow various properties of senescence, which we colloquially call aging. And all of them are important. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about humans, in fact, I think it may be the most important thing about this book, and you asked about myths earlier, the most important myth, I think, by far, is this idea that as you get older, it's normal to be less active. And that is just not true. We evolved to be grandparents. We evolved to live. One of the things that's most interesting about humans, maybe, is that we evolved to live about 20 years or so after we stop reproducing. No other animal does that except orcas, maybe killer whales. But with the exception of killer whales, humans have this really weird life history. We evolved to be grandparents. But grandparents in the old days weren't, retiring to Florida, or I don't know what they do in England or whatever, go to Mallorca or whatever, and kick up their heels and play golf or whatever with carts. Grandparents in the olden days, right, or in many cultures still today, are working, right? They're working in the fields, they're hunting, they're gathering, they're getting food for their children and their grandchildren, they're helping with childcare, and that physical activity is, that's what their job is, to be physically active. But in turn, that physical activity turns on an amazing suite of physiological processes that counter aging. It turns on repair and maintenance processes that not only keep our muscles strong, but also keep our DNA from accruing mutations, keep our mitochondria numbers high, keep the cells in our brain from accumulating gunk, so that prevents Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. I mean, for every system of the body, physical activity has benefits that slow the aging process. And so when you stop doing it, you accelerate, and that's the way in which you perceive it as accelerating aging. But really, it's the absence of physical activity which lets aging run amok.
In your first book in 2013, The Story of the Human Body, in chapter 12, you said, use this phrase, use it or lose it, basically. We evolved to use or lose our bodies. And I was sat with someone recently, and I was trying to figure out why it appears that when people retire, or the other instance I've seen is when their elderly partner passes away, it appears as if they don't live much longer.
Yeah.
It's kind of like folklore or something, that once you retire, your days are kind of numbered.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was trying to figure out the evolutionary reason for that, but it sounds like that's kind of what you explained there.
Well, I mean, I think part of that is depression, right? When you lose a partner, I mean, grief and depression, your cortisol levels go up, your immune system goes down. I mean, it's really tough on your body. I mean, psychosocial stress plays a serious physiological toll. But also, as you just pointed out, when people retire, they become less active, and that loss of activity has enormous effects on every aspect of our body. I mean, and our minds. I mean, physical activity is important not just for physical health, but also vital for mental health. And I think a lot of the problems that a lot of mental health issues we have today, depression, anxiety, some of them, to some extent, we can attribute that to less physical activity. And as people age, becoming less physically active, again, makes them much more vulnerable to a wide suite of diseases.
So would you say we shouldn't retire?
Or if you do retire, I mean, retiring is, again, another modern weird thing, right? Nobody retired in the past. I mean, if you're a farmer, it's like a subsistence farmer, and name it any place, right? It's not like suddenly you hit 65 and all of a sudden you no longer have to work in the fields. You work in the fields until you're dead, right? And hunter-gatherers don't retire. They continue to be physically active until they die, right? Or until they get too sick. So it's a very modern Western concept. And yes, we do pay a price for it. But you, of course, can replace, work that you do with challenging, rewarding, fun things to do. The important thing is just not to stop being physically active. One of my favorite studies ever published, without a doubt, is a study done by a guy named Ralph Paffenbarger. He realized that places like Harvard are fantastic for studying aging because Harvard, like other private universities, never lets go of their alumni. So until the day you die, they're asking you for money on a regular basis, and so they're and so he got the Alumni Association, the Harvard Development Office, to let him follow a series of Harvard alumni from several years and can keep asking them questions about their physical activity levels and also their diet and whether they smoked and stuff like that. And then he tracked them for 25, 30 years. And what he found was that the alumni, we've have to correct it for every factor you could think of, that as the alumni got older, the effect of physical activity on their health outcomes was bigger and bigger. So alumni who were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, for example, who were exercising 4 or 5 times a week, they had about 20% lower death rates. By the time they got to their 60s and 70s, the alumni who were exercising more had 50% lower death rates. So as you get older, and this has been replicated again many times, but what he showed was that as you get older, exercise becomes more, not less important for maintaining your health.
I've been thinking a lot about this because I was saying to Jack, my dad is 60-ish, but he's very, very out of shape. Very, very out of shape. And I was in Indonesia, and I was with my girlfriend, and we were going whitewater rafting. So we had to go down this really big hill. With all these stairs, it was like 300 meters of stairs. And I remember just thinking, my dad wouldn't be able to do this at his age, at 60, and I want to be able to go down those stairs when I'm his age, because at the bottom of there was a fun activity with someone I loved. And to think that I'll get to a point in my life where, not so far away in the grand scheme of things, where I won't be able to go up or down some stairs because I'm 60, because of my sort of genetic predisposition, as I saw it, was quite sad. But having heard you say that, it really feels much more like a choice than it is genetics.
Yeah, look, we have this expression in my field, which is that genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger, right? Some of us have genetic predispositions towards being, more likely to get diabetes or heart disease or this or that or the other. But our great-great-great-grandparents in different environments weren't getting these diseases, or they were getting them at much, much, much lower frequencies. It's not because they were dying earlier. It's because these diseases were less common. So I think we too often blame our genes for many of these diseases, or many of these health problems. And I'm not in any way denying the role of genetics, but that environment is way more important. And we have control over our environment to some extent. And so if you want to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, reduce your risk of diabetes, reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, dementia, exercise isn't a magic bullet. It's not going to prevent you from getting those diseases completely, but it lowers your risk quite substantially. And we know why too. I mean, we have an immense amount of data on why that's the case. For every single one of these diseases, we understand the mechanisms by which physical activity has important mechanistic effects on these diseases. So there's epidemiological data, there's mechanistic data, there's personal data. The problem is that it's hard to do, right? It takes willpower to overcome the inertia of doing what's completely normal, which is wanting to take it easy, right? I just flew yesterday from Denver to Boston, and in the airport, there are these escalators right next to the stairway, right? And the escalator and the stair, it wasn't a huge stairway. Everybody's lining up to take the escalator, and like the stairs are totally free. So being me, of course I'm not allowed to take the escalator unless I have to, right? So I ran up the stairs, but but those people taking the escalator, there's nothing wrong with them. They're not lazy. It's just an instinct, right? It's an instinct to take it easy when you can, right? Because we now live in a world where everybody can do that, right? Because we have escalators and lifts and cars and shopping carts and all these wonderful devices to make our lives easier. And now you have to overcome this fundamental basic instinct to take it easy in order to be physically active. And that's basically what exercise is. And so, and furthermore, if you're unfit and you're not really, exercising isn't any fun, right? It's unpleasant. You sweat and you get hot and you get cranky and it's not that rewarding until you get fit. And so people hate it, right? And then we blame them for being lazy, but they're actually just being normal. And I think we need to have more compassion towards people who struggle to exercise.
You were going through a series of diseases a second ago: Alzheimer's, high blood pressure, all of these kinds of things, cardiovascular diseases. I almost think we've come to assume that these are inevitabilities of life.
Yeah,
we'll get cancer.
Yeah.
One of us will get. Yeah. Someone in here is going to get Alzheimer's, and that's the way we live. So we're preparing to medicate when that day comes.
That's right.
I get, God forbid, diagnosed with something.
That's absolutely right. In fact, that's what medical students today are taught, right? If you go to medical school today, you are taught that as people get older, their blood pressure goes up. I can tell you that's just not true. It's in the Western world where people are physically inactive and eat crap diets that their blood pressure tends to go up. But there are plenty of people, I'm actually one of them, right, who don't have high blood pressure as they age. And guess what's the best way to prevent getting high blood pressure as you age? It's, it's not like a broken record, but we have this idea that as you get older, yes, and we're lucky, right? Because we don't die from smallpox when we're 30. We're lucky to get cancer when we're 60, right? What we've done is we've confused diseases that are more common with aging with age being a cause of those diseases in the first place. And they're not inevitable diseases. And many of them are preventable. And the problem is that in our society, we don't value prevention very much. We may talk about it, but we don't really put our money where our mouth is, right? In the US, which is arguably one of the worst healthcare systems, it is the worst healthcare system among the industrialized Western world. We spend approximately 3% of our medical budget on prevention. And yet when people walk into a doctor's office, 75% of the time the disease is, according to the Center for Disease Control, a preventable disease. So we essentially spend nothing to prevent diseases that overwhelm our system and cause enormous amounts of misery. It's a completely backward, stupid system. And so, and the good news is it's not that hard to prevent a lot of these things. It takes willpower and it takes education and it takes access to good quality food and whatever. So in the one sense, it's very depressing. On the other hand, the optimist in me says, we really can do something. And people, even if they're not wealthy or whatever, there are simple things that everybody can do to improve their health outcomes.
The prototypical recommendation is that after about 30 minutes of time awake, you should get out of your bed and you should just go to a different room and do something like, read a book or listen to a podcast. Don't eat because it then trains your brain to wake up to do that. Don't stop working or getting in front of a computer screen. I said listen to a podcast. Sure, just make sure your phone's in. You don't start scrolling any more than that. But you can do relaxing things, stretch, meditate. The reason is because if you start to spend a lot of time awake in your bed, your brain is an incredibly associative device. And very quickly, it will start to learn that this thing called your bed is this place where I'm always awake. And therefore, you start to learn through this repeated loop of behavior that I'm always going to be wide awake in bed. And we need to break that association. And that's why we say get out of bed after about 30 minutes, because you're just training your brain to think that this thing called my bed is the place where I'm never asleep. And we want to break that and only return to bed when you're sleepy. And there's no time limit for that. And that way, gradually, it's much better because you will relearn the association that your bed, just as when you were young, it was guaranteed that your bed is this place where you will always be asleep. The problem with that is many people don't want, it's the middle of the night, it's dark, it's cold. I'm just not going to get out of bed. So what else have you got in your toolbox, Matt? At that point, I would say, okay, that's reasonable. The first thing I would suggest is meditation. I am a hard-nosed scientist, and when I was researching that for the book, I just thought this sounds all a bit woo-woo, and I live and work in Berkeley, California, which is kind of the free speech, flower power movement, San Francisco, flowers in your hair business. I just thought this is all a bit, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. This is not for me. This meditation stuff. I couldn't get away from the strength of the data. It was immensely powerful regarding sleep and its benefits on insomnia and sleep. So I started meditating, and now I meditate for 10 minutes before bed every single night, and I've been doing that for about 4 years. So I would say, even if it's in the middle of the night, and if I wake up in the middle of the night, I'll start to try to walk myself through a meditation.
When I go to bed, I have to have something playing. I say have to, I shouldn't be that definitive. I like to have something playing, some kind of sound or noise or whatever. And much to my partner's dismay, my content of preference is serial killer podcasts or documentaries, or just like something which is really going to grab hold of my brain and focus me. So something like, it has to be really interesting to me for me to be able to focus on it. My partner is the opposite again. She likes silence. Why do I listen to serial killers?
It's different for different people's constitutions, and psychologies. And I can pathologize you all you like if you would wish me to. But I would say what's fundamentally going on here with meditation, and I'll come back to an alternative too. But the reason why some meditation apps as well have now started to do what's called sleep stories, which in some ways is what you're doing a version of with your podcast, harks back to when we were kids. For many parents, they would just read a book to their kid. The children's books, good night books, because you would read the child to sleep. And for some reason, as we developed into adults, we thought, well, we no longer benefit from having a story read to us to help us sleep. No, it's not true. We benefit hugely. In fact, the meditation company Calm, was saved by the introduction of sleep stories into their app. They were doing pretty well as a meditation app, but then they started to do sleep stories, and it became a unicorn company in terms of its valuation. It broke $1 billion, and it was on the back of sleep stories. And what they realized is that people were self-medicating their insomnia by way of meditation. So they latched onto that, and then they found that these stories, sleep stories, were great. And you've got now wonderful people who you've interviewed on the show. So what you're doing and what those sleep stories are doing and what meditation is doing, it's all the same thing, which is that it is taking your mind off itself. Because when you are struggling to sleep, or you've woken up in the middle of the night, what you don't want to be doing is focusing on either what did I do today? What did I not do today? What did I do poorly? Oh my goodness, what have I still got to do tomorrow? And at that point, things are just a disaster. You're wide awake. What all of the things that we've just discussed do is they take your mind off itself. And at that point, then you start to allow sleep to come back naturally. That's why one of the other suggestions is take yourself for a mental walk. So don't count sheep, by the way, that doesn't work. A colleague of mine at UC Berkeley did the study. It actually takes you longer to fall asleep if you're counting sheep. What she found, Dr. Alison Harvey, was that if you just close your eyes and you think about a walk that you take frequently, let's say it's a walk with the dog, and you think about it in high fidelity detail. So I close my eyes, I go out the door, I take a left down the steps, then I'm going to go up the street, I take the first left, past that pine tree. That's the level of detail. If you just walk yourself on that mental walk, sure enough, people fall asleep in about 50% less time, half the time it takes.
I think if you perceive it as helpful, it probably is, and I think that's where, and if your objective data shows that you're getting, the requisite time in these deeper stages of sleep, then go with it. I think what is actually, there's definitely the cold, dark, quiet, right? You need your room to be cold. You need to be cold, dark. You need to be quiet. So there's environmental stuff. You need to, stop eating a few hours before bed. Ideally, you need to have stable sleep wake time. Ideally, these are all things that are going to drive getting into these deeper stages of sleep. But the other thing that you probably do really well is you manage stress throughout the day. I think that's another, the things that we do during the day, how we, whether or not we're living our values, right? Do our behaviors align with things that we care about? Are we thinking about the things that we want to be thinking about? Are we managing our relationships effectively? So all the things that can manifest as stress, negative stress, will invariably rear its head during our sleep. Mm-hmm. But if we're managing those things during the day proactively and relatively well, generally speaking, sleep should happen, pretty naturally.
This is the thing with sleep stories and also my serial killer documentaries or serial killer podcasts that I listen to. Detail.
Exactly.
You get, even I've listened to Calm's sleep stories before, and the attention to detail in the sort of descriptive nature of what they're saying is so apparent. They'll say things like the cold, wet windowsill saw the raindrops, tapping against it one by one by one by one. And that sounds very similar to my serial killer documentaries when I hear about the serial killer coming in through the window.
Yeah.
At nighttime. And I wondered why the descriptive nature of it, the detail matters for dozing us off.
And because you've got limited bandwidth in terms of cognitive capacity.
Right.
And if you're consumed and you saturate your bandwidth with that level of detail, it's very hard for any of these other things called our worries and our anxieties to start entering into our mind. The other thing I would note, by the way, though, is if none of these things are working for you, if the fictional notion of serial killing is not working for you, if meditation is not working for you, if going on a mental walk is not working for you, this is the final suggestion I have. If you're lying there awake, firstly, by the way, if you're struggling with sleep, remove all clock faces from your bedroom. It's one of the best pieces of advice I can give you. Knowing what time of night it is no favor. So knowing now that it's 3:23 a.m. in the morning and I'm still struggling to fall asleep, and then I look back at the clock and it's now 4:03 a.m. and I've still been awake, and now it's 4:27 and I've got to wake up at 6:30 a.m. Knowing that has no utility for you. Remove all clock faces from your bedroom. It is a gift. But coming back to the final suggestion, if you don't want to get out of bed, if you don't want to listen to a podcast, the final thing I would say is just accept and say, look, it's okay. Tonight is not my night. It is not the worst thing in the world. And instead of trying to sleep, all I'm going to do here is lie in bed and I'm just going to rest. Because wouldn't it be lovely if someone came to you in the middle of your workday, you're just stressed, and someone said, by the way, just come into this room, there's a bed here, just lie down and just rest for an hour. Wouldn't it be lovely? Just have a good old rest for an hour. Just rest there. And I would say that if you can't sleep, just lie in bed, stop worrying about sleep and not being able to get it, stop worrying about the next day, just lie in there and enjoy a nice, good old rest. And by the way, usually what happens is that after you start thinking, okay, I'm going to rest, the next thing you remember is the alarm clock going off at 6:30 because finally you stop trying and sleep happens. So, yeah.
Of course. What about injury? Well, if I'm an athlete and I'm underslept, are there any studies that suggest I'm more prone to injury?
There are a few studies that do suggest getting insufficient sleep. So under 6 hours, there's been more fatigue-related injuries in adolescent athletes. There's also a study that has looked at under 8 hours of sleep. It still has an increased risk around 1.7-fold higher of injury.
1.7-fold?
Mm-hmm,
Is that 170%?
Yes, yeah, of higher risk of injury when you're getting under 8 hours of sleep versus those that got more than 8 hours of sleep. And so I think it's unclear exactly why you're specifically more at risk for injury, but I tried to take a look at the biomechanical changes of what happens when athletes are not getting sufficient sleep. In one of my early studies that has explored the biomechanical changes. And what we showed is that when you're not getting sufficient sleep for multiple days, you have more variability in your biomechanics.
So
which means, yeah, so you're moving differently. So you're not actually selecting probably your preferred coordination strategy. So for example, I had them doing a vertical jump. And if you're well rested, you likely should be able to do that very consistently as an elite athlete. But when you're not well rested, it's much more variable. So they're moving differently, and that may put people at risk for injury.
So they're like landing differently a little bit, jumping.
Yeah,
okay.
how their knees, their hips are coordinated together differs. And so that may put you at risk for injury down the road. But more to come, hopefully, on that front. There's just not that many studies that currently exist.
What do you think of the snooze button?
The snooze button. I'm not a huge fan of the snooze. I fully understand why people love to hit the snooze and then go back to bed. And if you're someone who does that, one of my suggestions is just to cut down so that you only hit the snooze once, 5 minutes later, start your day. The reason why is because it helps to maximize your REM or your dreaming sleep in those early morning hours. If you can actually sleep consolidated all the way until the time you have to wake up. So for example, if you're someone who hits the snooze button 5 times every 5 minutes for a half hour, it means that you're having very interrupted sleep for the last half hour of your night, versus if you just let yourself sleep consolidated all the way through and then maybe hit the snooze button just one time and then got yourself up to start your day. It means you would have given yourself another 25 minutes of consolidated sleep, likely that dreaming REM sleep that's so important for learning and memory. And so that is one just easy adjustment that you can make in terms of your morning approach to maximizing what you get during the night.
So what's the value in consolidating it versus just
having fragmented sleep?
Yeah.
So then if you're getting a lot of that REM sleep in those early morning hours and you're snoozing, you're going to be waking up and coming out of that REM sleep. So you likely are changing the stages of sleep you would be getting in those early hours. So you would then be awake and then probably going into lighter stages of sleep, awake, lighter stages of sleep, than necessarily having a solid REM period all the way until you wake up.
What's the cost of that?
So learning and memory and consolidation is definitely one area that we recognize as associated with that REM sleep. And so you want, as we talked about, it changes through the night. You want to have as much as possible, but you have to have just the duration. So when you get the most of it in the morning hours, if you cut that short and either wake up earlier or you're snoozing and you're interrupting it, you're not going to maximize the value you get of the hours in REM.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that those 25 minutes, I give them to REM sleep. Exactly. Versus just giving them to little fragmented light sleep.
Exactly.
So I'm better off just putting my alarm to the time that I actually have to get out of bed.
Exactly.
Just to maximize the amount of REM sleep that I get to consolidate my memories.
Are you a snoozer?
No, not really.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we all have our moments, but not really. I can't remember the last time I pressed the snooze button. But the thing that I do, and I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not, is because I have told myself, and I say told myself because I'm quite conscious of the BS that I believe about myself, but I've told myself that I'm like an owl chronotype or something, which by the way, I don't even know if it's true. And I don't know if chronotypes are true. And I typically work quite late. And I love working late. I get better ideas late. I do my writing pretty late at night as well. And so what I've done in my life is I've basically made sure that I don't have any meetings or any engagements before 11 o'clock. So even like this podcast today started at 11 o'clock.
Yes.
Basically nothing in my life starts till 11 o'clock. For that very reason, because if I do end up staying up a little bit late, I want to be able to kind of sleep through without having to set an alarm and just wake up naturally. What do you think of that? Is that suboptimal?
No, I think it's a great strategy. So there are chronotypes where you've mentioned you're more of an evening owl. You go to bed later. You like to wake up later as a natural predilection.
Is that real? Or
this is real. This is real.
Justifying myself.
No, there is a natural tendency for some to feel like they're evening owls. And there's others who feel like they do much better in the morning. So they go to bed earlier, they wake up earlier, they're more productive in the morning. Those are our morning larks. And then there is a group that's somewhere in the middle that don't strongly lean one way or another. But really what you're doing is you're making your sleep work to your chronotype and to your advantage, where you do feel like you're more productive in the evenings. And then you want to be able to maximize your sleep, waking up without an alarm and starting your day later. I think that's like a great strategy because a lot of people aren't able to have that flexibility. And so society often will force, particularly the night owls, onto an earlier schedule where you have to wake up, whether to go to work or other obligations or kids
and then we
at an earlier point. And then you're cutting your sleep short, like you mentioned, like with school. And then we're getting these, and then you're on a schedule that doesn't work synergistically with what your chronotype is.
On that point of naps and, Google sleep pods, naps and things like that, there was a point in my life where because I learned about REM sleep and the importance of REM sleep and deep sleep, and that happens a little bit further on into my, the 90-minute, look at me trying to tell a sleep expert scientist about
I love it.
But do you see what I mean? Like, this is my monkey brain. So I didn't understand the subject matter very well. Still really don't, to be honest. But in the first, it takes me a significant amount of time to get to deep sleep into REM sleep. How long, on average, would you say it takes?
Yeah, so you will probably go into light sleep in the first 10 to 15 minutes. Then you'll go down into deep sleep. You'll stay there for about 30, 40 minutes. Then you'll start to rise back up and you'll pop up and you'll have a short REM sleep period. And then you complete the non-REM to REM cycle after about 90 minutes and back down you go again, down into non-REM and up into REM. So on average for human beings, it's 90 minutes.
So I therefore assumed that napping really does nothing because I thought, well, it takes me so long to get to REM sleep and to deep sleep that if I've got 15 minutes, 20 minutes to nap, it's just a waste of time.
Right.
Was I wrong or was I right?
You were understandably wrong.
Okay, good. I'm happy because I've always rejected naps because I thought they don't matter because it takes me so long to get to a restorative state anyway. So
we've done lots of different studies with naps, we and other colleagues too. And what we found is that naps can transact some fantastic benefits. They can improve cardiovascular health, lower blood pressure. They can improve your learning and memory abilities. They can reset the emotional north of your magnetic compass in a good way, where you can de-escalate negative emotions and increase positive emotions. So naps certainly are a good thing, but with a big caveat that I'll come back to. Yes, you're right in the sense that to get a full cycle of sleep and to get into REM sleep, you would probably have to make that nap about 90 minutes. And in fact, a lot of the studies that we do, we will use a 90-minute nap duration of time so that the brain can cycle through all of those different stages of sleep. But you don't need to, nor would I suggest that you do. What we found is that different stages of sleep perform different functions for the brain at different times of night. There are actually 4 separate stages, stages 1 through 4, increasing in their depth of sleep. So stages 3 and 4 are those really deep stages of non-REM sleep. Stages 1 and 2, that's the lighter form of non-REM. And then you have rapid eye movement sleep, or what we think of as dream sleep. And people will sometimes say to me, how do I get more REM sleep? Or how do I get more deep sleep? And my response to them is, why do you want to get more REM sleep? And their answer is, well, isn't that the good stuff? And it turns out that there is no good stuff. It's all good stuff. You know, maybe with the exception of that light stage 1 non-REM sleep, that's shallow sleep, and we typically don't like to see too much of that. But stage 2 non-REM sleep, 3 and 4, they all have their different functions that we've discovered, and REM sleep has its functions. So you need all of them. You can't shortchange any of them. But for a nap, what we found is that you can get nice benefits for things like your learning and your memory, and it can even reduce some level of anxiety. Up to about 20 minutes. You can, in fact, you can nap. I think one of the studies, they brought a nap down to about 9 minutes in duration. And there was still some basic improvements for your sort of general level of alertness and reaction time. For example, if you're an athlete, that's non-trivial. So the reason I would say be careful with naps is for two main sort of suggestions. The first is try not to nap for about longer than 20 minutes, because once you go past 20 minutes, you really start to go down into those deeper stages of non-REM sleep. And if you wake up after about 45 minutes or 60 minutes, it's not a problem. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't or you couldn't. I'm just saying be aware, because when you come out of that deep sleep and you wake up from that deep sleep, normally that's not how you wake up. You will usually wake up out of lighter stages of sleep or out of REM sleep. It's rare that we wake up out of deep sleep. But if you nap and you nap for about 40 minutes, you'll probably go down into deep sleep. And at that point, if you wake up and your alarm goes off, then you're going to feel almost miserable and worse than you did before the nap, because you have what's called sleep inertia, which is essentially a sleep hangover, where the brain is still sort of pulled back into that deep sleep state. And it can take you almost an hour before you feel like you're back up to operating temperature and you're up to motorway speed. So I would say keep it to 20 minutes and you don't suffer too much of that inertia. You still get some nice benefits. Also, don't nap too late in the afternoon. Also, the final part is, if you are struggling with sleep at night, if you're someone who has insomnia or sleep difficulties, do not nap during the day. It's the worst thing that you can be doing, because when we're awake during the day, we build up a sleepiness chemical in our brain. It's called adenosine. And the longer that we're awake, the more adenosine that builds up. The more adenosine that builds up, the sleepier and sleepier that we feel. And when we sleep, the brain gets the chance to clear away all of that adenosine, all of that sleepiness. And somewhere between 7 to 9 hours after sleeping a full night, the brain has evacuated all of that sleepiness chemical, all of that adenosine, so that then we should wake up and we should feel refreshed and restored and not needing caffeine to function. Why is that relevant to naps? Well, it's relevant to naps because when you take a nap, it's like a pressure valve on a cooker. You're just releasing some of that healthy sleepiness that you've been building up. And therefore, if you are struggling with sleep at night and then you nap during the day, it's terrible, because you're taking away all of that healthy, good weight of sleepiness that we've been trying to build up on your shoulders to give you the best chance of a good night of sleep. That's why I would say, if you are suffering from insomnia, don't nap during the day. Also, even if you don't struggle with sleep at night, try not to nap after about 3 p.m. in the afternoon or 2 p.m. Napping late in the afternoon or in the early evening, it's a little bit like snacking before your main meal. It just takes the appetite off your sleep hunger. So try not to do that. But naps, for the most part, if you don't struggle with sleep, they are wonderful things. Just keep in mind the 20-minute sort of idea.
So what's the maximum length that a nap should be?
I like 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yes. So you can time that by setting an alarm. If it takes you 5 or 10 minutes to fall asleep, you can plan for that as well. And then setting an alarm to wake yourself up 30 minutes later. I think it's a great strategy when, again, you don't get sufficient sleep at night, or you had poor sleep leading into that night and you need a little bit of a boost later in the day.
And I grew up thinking that naps didn't work, because the minute I learned about sleep and these sleep cycles, and then it takes, 45, 60 minutes, whatever it is, to get into late stage sleep, like the REM sleep, the deep sleep, I thought, what's the point taking a 15, 20-minute nap if I'm not going to get into deep or REM sleep?
So there's benefit of just that 15-minute nap you mentioned. You want to stay in lighter stages of sleep because there's benefits of lighter stages of sleep. And that can give you that alertness and performance boost even when you're in lighter stages of sleep. You actually don't want to go into deeper stages of sleep, because when you take the longer naps, as I think you might have shared, you've taken the 2-hour nap, the 3-hour power nap, you wake up and you're much more sluggish, much more groggy. That's not a good state for you to go out and then do, work after that, or it's not the state that you want to be if you're a basketball player and have to go and play a game. But those deeper stages, you come out of what we call sleep inertia, with that sluggishness. And so it can also affect your sleep at night and make it harder to sleep subsequently. So you actually want to stay in those lighter stages of sleep and keep those naps very short.
So if I wanted to take a nap now, I have an espresso and then go and have my nap.
Exactly. Yes. The caveat is you do need to fall asleep within about 10 minutes, or else the caffeine will start to come on board. But if you do this in the late morning or early afternoon, it can be a helpful tool so that you have a boost in your alertness for a couple of hours.
How consistent are you with your sleep?
Very consistent.
I heard that in 2017 you started trying to sleep within sort of 25 to 30 minutes every single day.
Yep.
The same sleeping window.
That's right. Yeah. And yeah, it was a paper that came out by Andrew Phillips actually in the summer of 2017. And it basically was a 4-year study that was conducted at Harvard University looking at students, and they were basically student sleep. And they're trying to see, okay, what aspect of sleep is predictive of things like GPA and other, measures of kind of flourishing. And what they found is that basically sleep-wake time predicted GPA.
What's GPA for people?
Grade point average. Yeah, so it's the difference, the more regular, it's the difference between getting an A and a B by just stabilizing sleep-wake time. And so at that time, I was working with, tons of collegiate athletes. So NC2A athletes, professional athletes, so EPL, NBA, NFL, MLB, you name it, like the biggest high performers like in the world. And I started tracking this, just manually. At the time at Whoop, we didn't actually track this. This wasn't automated. I had to kind of do this in Excel. And then sure enough, sleep-wake time started predicting all these performance metrics that people care about. And we started rolling in some subjective measures. We had internal load, we had external load, of course, so all these objective measures, but I started rolling in some subjective measures. And sure enough, sleep-wake time just continued to ladder up to all these performance variables that people care about. So I started, of course, because I have access to all of these data, I'm like, shit, I need to like start stabilizing my sleep-wake time. And sure enough, summer 2017, I just that's basically like my non-negotiable. And yeah, I mean, I haven't been sick since 2017. I had a little tiny head cold that lasted 48 hours. But since then, I literally have not had a sniffle, a stomach ache. I didn't get COVID. Like I literally have not been sick. And I do a lot of other things well, but that has been the single biggest change.
Just sleeping and waking up at the same time.
That's it.
What is your routine now? How do you ensure that happens? Because
so the key to that is stabilizing when I wake up. So even when I travel, and I do travel, and I travel internationally, I travel to the West Coast, I try to maintain my home time zone as much as I can, as long as I can fulfill my business commitments and social, there might be a social element as well. But for the most part, I stabilize when I wake up. So I keep that consistent, even if I can't go to bed at the same time, I ensure that I wake up at the same time. And that basically sets my circadian rhythm. So I will then feel sleepy at the right time, and I can kind of keep that virtuous cycle going. If I have short sleep, I just basically try to build in a nap prior to 1:30 for 30 minutes to an hour, so I don't accumulate sleep debt. This is another thing that we can talk about. Sleep debt is wild in some of its correlations, like psychological safety and executive function. And but yeah, so that's how I manage short sleep. But I always try to wake up at the same time. So I'm getting that bolus of light at the same time every single day.
And what time do you wake up and go to sleep?
So I go to bed I kind of get into bed usually around 9:15, 9:30. I read for a half an hour, 45 minutes, a book, printed page, dim light. And then I fall asleep usually around 10. And then I wake up like at 6:14. No, I'm just kidding. Like around 6. Around 6.
The other thing I wanted to ask was about sleep and weight loss. I had a lot of health experts on this podcast recently, but none of them have really talked to me about the role that sleep or sleep deprivation plays in weight. Is there a relationship?
It's probably one of the most well-defined relationships that we know in all of sleep science. And it is at least a 3-part story. So the first emerging evidence came in terms of hormones. So there are what we call appetite regulating hormones. And the 2 principal ones of concern here are something called leptin and ghrelin. Now, leptin, when it's released, will signal to your brain that you're satisfied with your food, you are satiated, and you are no longer hungry. Ghrelin does the opposite. When ghrelin is released, it says, no, you're not satisfied with your food, you are not full, you still want to eat more, you are still hungry. And some of the first studies, they started to just limit people, restrict people's sleep to 6 hours or 5 hours or 4 hours. And what they found was that there was, firstly, that signal leptin that says, no, you're satisfied with your food, you don't want to eat anymore, you're full. That signal of fullness, satiation, was decreased by 18%. If that wasn't bad enough, ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, that leapt up by 28%. Overall hunger levels rose by about 26%. So firstly, it's almost like double jeopardy, that you are getting punished twice for the same crime of not sleeping enough. Once by losing the signal of I'm full, I don't want to eat anymore. And once again for no, I'm much more hungry and I'm just going to overeat, which is ghrelin. So what that produces is a profile of increased eating. So on average, underslept individuals started to eat in those studies about 300 to 400 extra calories at each sitting by way of insufficient sleep. Then what they discovered is that it's not just that you want to eat more, it's what it is that you have a craving for when you are underslept. And this is the problem. What they found is that when you are underslept, you eat more of everything, but you especially eat more of these heavy-hitting, stodgy carbohydrates, bread, pasta, pizza. The next thing that you started to eat, have a preference for, was simple sugary foods, sweets and chocolate. And then finally, you started to crave very salty food, and high sodium food intake will increase your blood pressure. So that was the first of the three mechanisms. Then we did a study where we said, perhaps it's not just the circulating hormones in the body. The brain is the ultimate arbiter of your food decisions. So what's going on in the brain? So we took a group of perfectly healthy individuals and we put them through the experiment twice. Once when they'd had a full 8 hours of sleep, and once when we deprived them of sleep. And then the next day we placed them inside an MRI scanner and we showed them images of lots of different foods that range from being sort of, very healthy to being very unhealthy, and sort of ice cream and, chocolate and pizza and things, to leafy salads and nuts and greens and vegetables. And we asked them to rate how much they wanted that food for each item. Now we did something a bit sort of dastardly to make it more ecologically correct, so that they weren't just saying, okay, they probably think I should probably say that's healthy. We said, we're going to randomly select one of these images, these food images that you see. And after you get out the brain scanner, we're going to give you that food and we're going to politely ask you to eat it all. So it made it a bit more realistic, so the choices were more, as much as that we could. So what we found is that when they were sleep deprived, the deep hedonic centers, the emotional centers of the brain, these desire centers, these reward centers, they ramped up in their activity in response to these highly desirable, highly unhealthy foods. So these more basic sort of, guttural parts of the brain, as it were, these reward centers were lighting up much more strongly when you were sleep deprived. Worse still, the impulse control regions in the front of the brain, what we call the prefrontal cortex, they were shut down, they were taken offline. So as a consequence, you lost your impulse control. And that's why you start to then say, when I'm sleep deprived at the food sort of buffet, I'm not going to do salad. I'm just going to, that pizza looks awful good, or that pasta with the cream, I'm just going to go into that, all go. So it's what we call a pattern in terms of brain activity in neuroscience of hedonic eating, that your brain goes into this hedonic desire profile. So now we understood it's not just hormones in the body, it's also changes in the brain. Then came the finding that there's another chemical in the body that's responsible. And this comes on to cannabis. When people that you may know have smoked cannabis, they'll often say, I get viciously hungry, I get the munchies, I get really hungry. That's no coincidence, because cannabis will stimulate appetite. Now, we all have naturally occurring cannabis compounds in our brain and our bodies. They are called endocannabinoids. Endo meaning comes from inside us, whereas the cannabis that comes externally when you sort of smoke it or take edibles. So endocannabinoids do many things for the brain and the body, but one of the things that they do is control your appetite and your hunger. And what we found is that when you sleep-deprived individuals, these naturally occurring endocannabinoids rocketed up by over 20%, cranking up people's appetite. And so these three ways lead you to start packing on. When insufficient sleep is occurring, when sleep gets short, your waistline typically starts to expand. And we now understand the reasons. If that wasn't bad enough,
it is bad enough.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Can you just stop, Matt? Please? Honestly, I've really. The last thing that we discovered is that, let's say that you're trying to be really careful and you're trying to diet and you're trying to lose weight. If you're not getting sufficient sleep, then 60% of all of the weight that you lose will come from lean muscle mass.
Oh God, no.
And not fat.
Not the muscle.
I know, exactly. So in other words, when you are dieting but you are underslept, you lose what you want to keep, which is muscle, and you keep what you want to lose, which is fat. So again, I'm sold. Not an ideal situation.
And I think one of the biggest myths out there is that you need 8 hours of sleep a night, and that sitting is the new smoking. That basically, and if you think about those two different myths, why is it that we're constantly told to sleep more and to sit less? Actually, it seems a little contradictory to me, right? And it turns out that that let's take sitting first. So there are all these these slogans like sitting is the new smoking and it's really bad for you. And, every time you sit in your chair, you lose 2 hours of your life and whatever. It turns out that all animals sit, right? My dog sits, cows sit, chickens sit, every animal sits. And hunter-gatherers also sit. In fact, some of my students actually put sensors on hunter-gatherers, and we're doing some research in farmers as well, but they sit just as much as Westerners. So sitting there's nothing special about about today's life. It's that we sit all day long and don't do anything when we're not sitting, right? So if you, and furthermore, the big difference is not so much how much we sit, but how we sit. So it turns out that people who, if you get up every once in a while, right? Interrupted sitting is actually much more healthy than non-interrupted sitting for the same amount of time. So in other words, two people might, in the West, people sit for an average about 40 minutes at about, whereas hunter-gatherers, for example, or farmers in Africa where we work, get up every about 10, 15 minutes. And when you do that, you actually, it's like turning on the engine of your car. You're driving around the block. You're turning on all kinds of cellular mechanisms. You lower blood sugar levels. All kinds of genes get activated. And it turns out that is by far the most important way to sit. So just get up every once in a while. Just pee frequently, make a cup of tea, pet your dog, whatever.
Thinking when I'm on planes and I've got a long flight.
Yeah, I always sit in the aisle, right? So I can get up a lot, always. And
what about sleep then?
So sleep is another interesting one. So this idea that, that you need 8 hours of sleep has been around for a long time. It's been around basically since the Industrial Revolution. But if you actually, so colleagues in my field, so in evolutionary medicine, have put sensors on people who don't have all the things that we're told have destroyed sleep. So think about it. We're told that TV and lights and our phones and all these things are preventing us from sleeping. Edison destroyed sleep, right? So when you put sensors on people who don't have any electricity, and they don't have TVs, and they don't have phones, and they don't have any of these gadgetry, right? Electricity. It turns out they sleep like 6 to 7 hours a night, and they don't nap. So this idea that natural human beings sleep 8 hours a night is just nonsense. It's just not true. And furthermore, when you start looking at the data, 7 hours, if you graph sort of how many hours a night you sleep on the x-axis and sort of some outcome like cardiovascular disease or just how likely you are to die, it's kind of a U-shaped curve. So people who don't get much sleep are in trouble. But the bottom of that curve is pretty much always about 7 hours. So people actually do better if they sleep 7 hours rather than 8 hours. And yet we're told that if you don't sleep 8 hours, there's something wrong, right?
Oh, so you can oversleep.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's also some complexity to this too, because of course people who are ill might be sleeping more, and so there's some biases that creep into how you analyze the data. But basically, it turns out that 7 is for most people optimal, but there's a lot of variation, right? Teenagers sleep more, older people sleep less. It's complicated.
A 2021 study found that less than 7 hours of sleep is associated with increased risk of injury, and if this is sustained for at least 14 days, the risk of muscle and bone injury is 1.7 times, almost 2 times higher.
Yeah.
So as someone that goes to the gym a lot and likes to work out, if I have a high sleep debt, then I'm much more likely to get an injury, almost 2 times more likely to get an injury if that's sustained.
That's right.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I'm so grateful that I think folks are finally realizing that sleep is the greatest natural performance enhancer that we have on this planet. That is certainly super evident in all the research that we're doing.
What about sleep and sex?
Sex with a partner is a health promoting behavior, and we have found that in our research.
What research have you done?
Yeah, I mean, we actually haven't published it yet, so this is preliminary data. But people who are reporting that they're having sex before bed, so within a few hours of when they intend to sleep with a partner, have better markers of sleep and recovery.
You said with a partner very intentionally there.
I did, yeah. We don't see the same effect when folks are having sex without a partner and reporting it.
How'd you have sex without a partner?
I mean, all right, I should say a partner like a spouse or a boyfriend or someone who you're consistently with. So we're talking about, I guess, not one night stands. Sorry, I should have clarified it.
I thought you meant without a human at all.
Oh, got it. Yeah, I'm talking about human sex here. Yeah.
Does masturbation not have the same implications?
We didn't see big effects with masturbation.
Are people reporting that though on Whoop?
They sure are.
They are?
I should say that it is completely optional to track. So people can opt into tracking these things. Again, it is completely de-identified. We have no ability to know who's doing what in terms of journal tracking and behaviors. So we don't actually see any big effects with masturbation and any markers of sleep and recovery. So no strong effects there.
HRV, heart rate variability. Become absolutely obsessed with it. Maybe a little bit too obsessed with it, one might argue. I just check it every day. So the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is I look at it.
Yeah.
Just to understand how my body has recovered from the night before.
Right.
What is HRV?
It's most simply the time interval between heartbeats, and it's a function of the heart, but it originates in the autonomic nervous system. And as we talked about, the autonomic nervous system has 2 branches, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Parasympathetic is rest and digest, sympathetic is fight or flight, and they're both competing to send signals to the heart. When you are super recovered, your heart is going to be responsive to both branches of that autonomic nervous system in a very kind of dynamic way. So whatever you want to do and what's happening in your environment, you're able to basically make a match the more recovered you are, if that makes sense. So you'll be able to respond and react to environmental stress in kind of a more high-performing way, I suppose, is the best way to say it. So heart rate variability is kind of a measure of that ability to adapt to your environment in a functional way.
And a high heart rate variability, which is more varying heartbeats. is better.
Yeah, more variability, the better. So higher heart rate variability should be correlated with a better adaptation to environmental stress.
So a low heart rate variability would sound something like this. Bum, bum, bum.
That's
bum,
exactly right.
Bum, bum. Very, very consistent. Not good.
Right.
A high heart rate variability will sound like bum, 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 bum. So really varied.
Perfect.
So
Beautiful,
it's
beautiful
paradoxical.
Yes.
That variation
is better. Yeah.
You'd think that if something was consistent,
yeah,
it would be better.
I know. In all other cases, it is. But in the case of heart rate variability, it's very counterintuitive. And what's great is heart rate variability is modifiable to a degree.
What's an average heart rate variability?
So it's all based on genetics. It's really tough, right? Because I don't know what your heart rate variability was when you were born, right? So I don't know like what your potential for heart rate variability is. And I think that's the only thing that I think we can say, and I think how people need to think about it is when you come onto the Whoop platform, for example, you're going to get your heart rate variability. You're going to develop a baseline. And I think what people need to understand is that every choice you've kind of made leading up to that moment is going to determine like your baseline heart rate variability. So if you drank and take drugs and have a lot of childhood trauma, that might actually yield a lower baseline heart rate variability relative to your own potential, right? So it's very hard to compare because of all of that. But then just genetics, heart size, gender, like all of those things, biological sex, all of those things have an impact on your heart rate variability, on your baseline. So you don't want to compare. There's no good. That said, I think the higher the better, generally.
What's the average?
Well, it depends on age. So it decreases, every year your heart variability is going to decrease
by how much?
A bit. I think it's like 3 to 4% or something.
That's terrifying.
Which is kind of a lot. Yeah. The average on the Whoop platform, from the 20 to 30 year olds is somewhere in the tune of kind of 65, 70, 30 to 40 year olds, a little bit lower, 40 to 50s, it's kind of in the 50s range, I think. So definitely it gets worse as you age. But I think why people are obsessed about it is it is a really good marker of just the overall state of your mental, physical, and emotional health.
Do women and men have variance in that?
They do, yeah. So generally men would have higher heart rate variability than women, I think, at baseline, bigger heart size.
I'm trying to get my heart rate variability up. What are the most important things for me to be thinking about? Because it seems to be a bit of a mystery, this heart rate variability thing.
So there's definitely some things that will directly impact your heart rate variability. Sleep-wake time. So stabilizing when you go to bed and wake up.
Yeah.
Wake onset being kind of the number one priority. You want to wake up at a regular time every single day. You want to get a huge bolus of light as soon as you wake up. You want to get a lot of natural light during the day. Okay. All of these things are going to impact inflammation and cortisol, like all of the things that are kind of circulating in our body that we need to be circulating. And when we're not doing some of these behaviors, they're not circulating in our body, which have negative downstream effects. You want to mitigate stress throughout the day. So, stress is not bad, but we need to proactively manage bouts of stress with appropriate levels of rest, right? When we are going, and we can only sustain that for so long. So just being proactive with stress rest cycles throughout the day, really important. As we go, we want to eat a bulk of our calories in the morning, lots and lots of protein. We want to make sure that we get lots of protein. I think folks don't probably get enough protein. We want to get lots of protein, bias early in the day, stop eating a few hours before bedtime, and make sure you're hydrated throughout the day. Yes, absolutely. So I can go down a very deep rabbit hole in terms of optimal training protocols, but in sum, we want to make sure that we're polarizing our training in that we're doing, zone 5, which is, kind of max effort, where we're out of breath a couple times a week. Okay. 2 to 3 times a week. And then we want to do zone 2, which is kind of, just a low level, 60% of our max heart rate. We want to do that for, 200 to 300 minutes per week, which I know sounds like a lot. The recommendation is 150 minutes. I think it's I don't think that's enough, frankly, but if we're talking about optimizing heart rate variability, that would be the protocol. We want to strength train a few times a week. That would be a way to maximize interplay between the cardiovascular and the nervous system, right? There's definitely a way to train to do that. And what I just described will kind of get you there roughly. So we talked about time restricted eating or stopping our feeding window 3 hours before we intend to sleep. Huge. No alcohol. Obviously, again, if we're interested in optimizing our ability to adapt to environmental stress, that is, and improve our heart rate variability, really important we abstain from alcohol. And then I would say, spending sufficient time in bed is going to be really important. That is not accumulating sleep debt.
What
yeah,
about
that's the
having
laundry
friends?
list.
What about having friends?
Yes, connection. Folks being around individuals who support your values is absolutely essential.
We talked a little bit about exercise there, but there's also just like the general sedentariness of our lives. I was looking at some research a couple of years ago, which I included in my first book, which shows that in the Western world, we're getting increasingly more sedentary. It's kind of like this downward graph that just shows every year people move less because we've got Ubers now, and we're working more in offices, and we're working even more from home now, and we're optimizing activity out of our lives. And surely that has an implication for heart variability as well.
There's no question that sedentary behavior, I think where we go wrong is we think I can wake up and work out for an hour, and then that gives me license to sit for the rest of the day. But we know that for individuals who are sitting for more than 4 hours in a row, so consolidated sitting for 4-hour blocks, is associated with increased mortality rates. So 4 hours of sedentary behavior, which, consolidated, right? So the ideal protocol, if we want to, basically improve all these parameters of health that we're talking about, specifically heart variability, you want to break up your sedentary time. So every half an hour to an hour, you'd want to get up, move around for 5 minutes or so, and then get back to your work.
In 2020, you wrote an article where you offered 5 ways to improve our HRV. And HRV, as I say, is super important because it's linked to all of these health markers. Yeah. It's linked to immunity. It's linked to all of these things that really, really matter. And there was a couple of sort of surprising suggestions you made in that article. One of them was about practicing gratitude.
Yeah. I mean, I think what the research says is that actually receiving gratitude has the most powerful effect on our mood and our feelings of well-being. So if I were to receive a thank you letter, for example, and really internalize that, that's going to have the biggest long-term effect on my feelings of well-being. But there's also great research that shows giving thanks as well and expressing gratitude also has, lots of positive implications for our psychological functioning.
And I guess this brings into focus the psychological element of health and HRV and and sleep and all these things that we talked about, like stress and anxiety. You're currently finishing a PhD in psychology, right?
That's right. Yes.
And again, it links to something that was written in that article as well, where you talk about a growth mindset. Again, that's psychology.
Yes.
Why does this matter? This growth mindset thing, this, gratitude, psychology, why does that matter?
Yeah. I mean, I think it relates to just our, whether or not we feel that growth in the future is possible. Do we feel like we have the potential to grow and to learn? And do we feel optimistic about the future? I mean, that's really what growth mindset is, right? And you can imagine if you don't feel optimistic about the future, you don't feel like growth is possible, you feel really limited in your capabilities, right? And you feel limited in your happiness. So I think that, there's, a really strong connection between, believing that the future is positive and that is going to manifest in a measure like heart rate variability. It's going to manifest physiologically.
There's this author called Sean Anker.
Oh, Sean Aker, from Harvard.
His name.
Yeah, Aker. Mm-hmm.
He does a lot of work on this idea of growth mindset as a way to sort of counteract stress, which I find fascinating.
He does, yeah.
He found that doctors in a positive state of mind perform diagnoses 19% faster and more accurately than doctors that are neutral. And he also found that positive employees are 31% more productive than negative employees.
Yeah, and I think our life circumstance, kind of certainly can tilt us in one direction or another. But I do think that we have a genetic predisposition to, the cup is half empty versus half full. I think there's something to that research and that literature. But all the things that we're talking about, I think, provide a foundation. Right. So a lot of the physiological stuff that we're talking about, the circadian stuff, the sleep stuff, the recovery stuff, right? The stress management, when we're eating our food, how we're training, right? All of these things kind of position us to, I think, leverage our mindset in a way that is the most productive, right? When we're not kind of taking care of these physiological things, we don't feel like we have purpose. We talk about this. We don't feel the skills and resources to do the things that we want to do in our life. It's really hard to talk ourselves into a better future, right? And it's hard to kind of move around our mindset. But if we can just kind of attend to some of these physiological and psychological things, we can actually start to take more control of our mindset. So I think a lot of times, this is, I think, frustrating in the field of psychology, we talk about growth mindset without actually talking about the behaviors that actually underpin that. And that's, I think, a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is that, there's these core influences, physiological and psychological, that if we can understand and build an infrastructure to allow those kind of behaviors to come to life in our everyday, we're in a position then to have like a growth mindset, right? But without that foundation
of good habits and good behaviors,
it's hard to believe that the future is bright.
When I was doing my PhD, I was studying people with dementia, and we were trying to understand what type of different dementia that they had very early on in the course of their disease. And we were looking at patterns of brainwave activity. So I was placing electrodes all over the head, and I was measuring them, and I was trying to differentially diagnose them very early on. And I was getting no good data whatsoever. It was miserable. Nothing was landing. And one day I went home at the weekend and sort of with all of my printed journals, and I go to my doctor's residence and have this sort of igloo of journals around me that I would sit and read at the weekend. Which probably tells you everything about my social life at the weekend if that's what I was doing. But so I was reading these journals, and it occurred to me that some of these dementias were eating away at the sleep centers in the brain, and others would leave them untouched. And at that moment, I realized I'm measuring my patients at the wrong time. I'm measuring them when they're awake. I should be measuring them when they're asleep. Started doing that, got amazing results. And at that point, I wanted to ask the question, well, I wonder if their sleep problems are not simply a symptom of the dementia. I wonder if it's a potential cause of the dementia. And at that point, I started to think, well, so then what is this thing called sleep? And what I learned is that some of the greatest minds in the past 100 years had tried to answer a very simple question. Why do we sleep? And, 30 years ago, in fact, the crass answer was that we sleep to cure sleepiness, which tells you nothing about it. It's like saying, I eat to cure hunger. Well, no, that's not the right answer. Now, 30 years later, we've had to upend the question, and we now have to ask, is there any physiological system in your body? Is there any operation of your mind that isn't wonderfully enhanced when you get sleep or demonstrably impaired when you don't get enough? And the answer seems to be no there. So my journey into the science of sleep really was an accident. But at that moment in time, when I started reading about sleep, I utterly fell in love with the topic.
Is there a correlation here between how we deal with stressful events in our lives as well? Because I'm assuming there must be.
Absolutely. Managing stress throughout the day and the degree or even during the night can definitely increase your tolerance for stress. So, deploying breath work, for example, as, on-demand self-regulation tool to pay down in the moment stress can be, and to activate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system can be really powerful. So, I kind of call these mini moments of deactivation. So doing that proactively for folks who are in these high stakes, high stress environments is an amazing strategy. Because lots of those folks, again, if you think about just baseline, when you are engaging in shift work and you're awake during the night, your system is humming at a kind of a stress level that is above what would be normal, right? Like your system is having to work so much harder to maintain homeostasis because you're doing exactly the opposite of what your body wants to do. So all of the kind of biological preferences are being bypassed, right? When you're up during the biological night. So to pay down some of that stress, these mini moments of deactivation are absolutely critical for that population. So that means just literally taking 30 seconds where you're doing the physiological sigh, for example, which we know has emerged as being the most efficacious breathwork technique in the moment to reduce not only in the moment anxiety and stress, but actually, your perception of anxiety and stress, like in the future.
What is that sigh?
The physiological sigh. It's basically a double inhale followed by an extended exhale. Perfect. That's exactly right. So basically, like when you're crying, you kind of do that double inhale followed by an extended exhale. But that reduces stress in the moment in a really powerful way. And if you do that, 5-10 times, you end up activating the parasympathetic branch. So you're reducing your heart rate, and kind of doing that throughout the day is a great way to mitigate negative stress accumulation.
There's a pretty unfortunate paradox, a pretty tragic paradox in the fact that our shift workers, some of them like doctors especially, are the people that we need to be most focused.
Firing on all cylinders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But those are the people that are, from what I've learned today about the circadian rhythm, most likely to suffer with things like focus and sleep and all of those things that are imperative to showing up well.
Yeah. I mean, there's a relationship. We know that with every 45 minutes of sleep deprivation accrued on the Whoop platform, we see a 5 to 10% next day decrease in mental control. Executive function. So we measure this with an MBAC and a Stroop. So these kind of performance tests to measure executive function. And we see for every 45 minutes of sleep debt accrued, we see up to 10% decrease or decline in next day executive function.
And what does executive function mean for people that are?
Our ability to make decisions.
It brings into question something that I know a lot of people think when they hear conversations like this. They think, oh, but I just don't have the motivation, Kristen. You know, and there's this ongoing conversation about which comes first. Is it the action or is it the motivation? There's clearly, in my life, I've seen this clear two-way link through what I do and how I feel and what I do.
Yeah.
So if I want to influence the other, I do the other. I.e., if I want to feel great, I have to focus on my actions. And if I want to act great, I'll focus on how I feel, for example. You know what I mean? Because people hear, you know, the discipline that you practice in your life and they go, oh God, you must have so much motivation. You know, the people that are watching junk TV at 3 a.m. in the morning and eating junk food at 3 a.m. in the morning, they look at you and go, she just got something I just haven't got. So I can't relate. You know, I can't become a Kristen. What is the message those people need to hear? The ones that feel like motivation is their problem.
I mean, I think it's understanding how do we actually produce energy, right? Because that's really at the core of what motivation is, right? It's the energy, right? And a couple things influence our energy production or put a ceiling on motivation. It's called it's appraisal. So how relevant we think a task is, and then how we are perceiving the task. Is it hard? Is it easy? Is it challenging? Right? So appraisal and perception are going to work together to put a ceiling on your potential for motivation. If someone really wants to make change, where do they start?
Where do they start?
You know, I'm going to say it. Sleep, wake time. Like wake up at the same time every day and get as much as light as humanly possible. That will set the tone for the rest of the day and put you in a position where you can fall asleep at a regular time, night after night. Like you have to address that. The second thing is I would consolidate your eating window. You know, keep it within a 10-hour time frame. Eat all of your calories within a 10-hour time frame and try to leave a couple-hour buffer between when you intend to sleep and your last calorie. Like just those two things are pretty low barrier to entry, right? And that will increase mood. You'll improve your body composition, right? Just by narrowing that window, you will, all the effects that we talked about in terms of the cardiometabolic effects from just stabilizing sleep-wake time, the mood effects from stabilizing sleep-wake time, that will back you into having a better relationship with light, right? Which we know light is at the core of human health and functioning. So those two things I would say is the place to start. I think the downstream effect of just those two things is pretty profound. And then I think in parallel, just figuring out who do you actually want to be in the world? Like what do you want your identity to be? And I don't know that people actually think enough about that. There's so many distractions in this world. I mean, we can just drown ourselves with just stuff it's just coming at us, content all the time. And we can't discern, we haven't done the work to be able to discern what is actually important to us. Like we don't have the capacity to direct our thoughts and our attention in a way that's rewarding, right? Because we haven't built that skill or that muscle. So I think like getting that under control is another way, is like really figuring out what is my relationship with technology? Like, what do I want that to be? How do I actually want to spend my time?
Use the word there, sleep debt. What is sleep debt?
So that's basically what you need versus what you actually got. And that's highly individual, right? And that's one of the kind of beautiful things on the Whoop platform is that we learn your body, we learn how efficient sleeper you are, we learn what your optimal sleep-wake time should be, and we basically tell you how much time you need to spend in bed. So a lot of the work that my team has done specifically at Whoop is to try to understand, what is this relationship of sleep debt to other performance metrics that we care about, right? That tell us a story about someone's ability to kind of function in their environment. And one of the studies that we did was looking specifically at business executives, so CEO types. And we basically looked at, this one was a 6-month study, looking at 2 different cohorts, both, I think equal distribution between men and women. And what we saw was for every 45 minutes of sleep debt accrued in these business leaders, we saw a 5 to 10% decrease in next day executive function. So the leader's ability to make decisions in the presence of sleep debt, gets worse the more sleep debt you accrue. We did a follow-up study, and this one was wild. So we basically looked at, it was about 70 business executive CEO types, and we looked at all of their objective markers, sleep debt being one of them, and we look at the psychological safety of their direct reports during team meetings.
And define psychological safety for
how safe you feel to show up in your environment as your true, most authentic self. And what we saw is, again, for every 45 minutes of sleep that the leader had, there was a significant decrease in psychological safety of the direct reports. So they felt less safe in their environment to show up as their true self when their leader had 45 minutes of sleep debt accrued. And some of these folks were carrying a couple hours of sleep debt. So, and there's a linear relationship between the amount of psychological safety and the amount of sleep that the leader had. So, and what was so interesting and I think compelling about this research is that the leader had no idea, they couldn't perceive their own cognitive, physical, and emotional declines, right? But that's what's so insidious about sleep deprivation is that you can't really tell when you're operating at a lower level. You just adapt to that lower level of functioning. But everyone around you can feel it, right? Just with how you hold your face, how you emote, the kind of eye contact you make, how tolerant you are. And you think about how sleep deprivation, and I think this is really what this research surfaces, it's not just sleep deprivation just doesn't impact me, right? It's going to impact every single person I come in contact with. And from a business perspective, just from a sheer numbers perspective, Google did a study called Aristotle, and they looked at a bunch of different metrics related to team performance. And what emerged in that study as being most predictive of team performance was the degree to which the team had psychological safety, felt safe in their environment to kind of show up as their true self. And they brought in to the tune of $4.5 million more than teams who are lacking psychological safety. So this is a really important concept that I don't think a lot of people talk about. But when we go back to this concept of the principle of non-neutrality, right? And what are behaviors that enable you to live your values and kind of show up as your best self as consistently as possible, minimizing sleep debt is right there at the top of the list.
It's fascinating. And as it relates to sort of accident and injury, is there a correlation between sort of injury of oneself and accidents you commit on others? Correlation between that and sleep debt?
It's very well established that the more sleep debt you're carrying, the more accident prone you are, the more risk you're going to take. We see this in the medical field. We see this, in just car accidents, and the list goes on and on.
Car accidents. A 2016 study by the Foundation for Traffic Safety found that drivers who reported that they usually sleep 4 to 5 hours per day had 5.4 times the crash rate of drivers who usually sleep for 7 hours or more a day, which is horrifying.
Yeah, I know. When we think about, sleep, we're not getting better at it as a society. And I think we're kind of coming at this conversation from the wrong lens. We're telling folks just to spend more time in bed without addressing the behaviors that actually enable us to fall asleep and stay asleep. That's the conversation. And it's not about spending more time in bed. And that might be what needs to happen, but it's about, you're not going to get there for folks who are not thinking about all the circadian things that we're talking about. And, some of the environmental stuff, the cold, dark, the quiet, yes, that matters. But at a foundational level, I think folks are not engaging in the behaviors that are going to enable us to pay down this sleep deprivation.
I guess I've got to understand what this concept or this idea of sleep debt is, because I want to make sure I'm super clear on what it is and isn't. Because when you say the word debt, I assume it's kind of like I owe the sleep bank manager a couple of hours. But I've kind of gone back and forward on this idea of sleep debt. I think some people have told me that it's real. Some people have told me that it's not real. And I don't know where I should stand on it.
Yes.
If I haven't, so for example, I flew into LA, the first couple of nights my sleep wasn't great. But I had good sleep last night. Am I still paying for it now?
The way I explain the concept of sleep debt is that your body requires a certain amount every single night. Again, we talked about individual variability, but let's just say you need 8 hours every night. And conceptually, if you don't meet that 8 hours, then you build up a debt. So if you're only getting 6 hours a night, you now have 2 hours of debt built up. If you go Monday to Friday, that's 5 days. Now you have 10 hours built up, right? 2 hours every night becomes 10 hours. And if you then sleep in on a Saturday and you get, let's just say 10 hours of sleep, you've paid back 2 of those hours, but you still have 8 hours left to go.
My body knows.
Yes. So conceptually, that's the idea of accumulating sleep debt. I do stand in the camp that believes that does accumulate over time. We do think that you can pay back some of that debt on the short term, right? So what you lost, like you said, this past day or this past week, maybe this past month, you should pay that back with getting extra sleep, or we call sleep extension. We don't think that you can surplus and bank more and that you can pull from that in the future. But we recognize that if you've got insufficient sleep, that if you extend it over a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, then you will see benefits in your reaction time, in your fatigue levels, in your performance outcomes. And so we do recommend that as a tool, especially if you know that you're going to have a day where you're going to have sleep loss. So it's a strategy, for example, if you know, okay, in a week, I'm going to have a project and I'm not going to be getting enough sleep that night. Then what you can do in the days leading up to it is getting sufficient sleep, but arguably even more, so that we know when it gets to that project, the decrements that you'll experience tend to be less robust than if you went into it with just, say, that was 5 hours.
So what evidence do you have that sleep debt is a real thing? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
So what I've dedicated my career to is trying to understand how to pay back sleep debt with sleep extension interventions. So what that means is, typically, I'm working with a number of collegiate athletes where many of them are not getting what they need, because when we start these studies, many of them have high fatigue levels. They are reacting slowly. We often see lapses in their judgment and their ability to ultimately perform and function, which is what they consider their baseline. But then when we actually challenge them by paying back some of that debt by getting additional hours, when we monitor the differences that can make over multiple weeks, that's where we see there's improvement in the reaction time, their fatigue levels drop, their performance on the field improves. And so we recognize what has changed in this is trying to pay back some of that accumulated debt when the rest of their training has been held consistent. So we've been trying to maintain the rest of their training.
Which is key, which is the key point, because in my mind, I go, well, maybe if you've got the athlete to sleep well on that first night, then when they've showed up to training, they've trained a little bit harder. They've built their muscles a little bit more. They've had better recovery in their muscles. So then the next day, the same thing happens because they've slept. So it's actually just that they're training better, which is causing them to improve their scores.
That's fair. We've tried to hold their training to be consistent and choosing periods where their training isn't going to vary significantly, as well as you can almost make the argument too that sometimes as the season goes on, athletes get more fatigued, more tired, and that can be actually a decrement to how they'll perform. So when we see the benefits come down the road as the season potentially gets even longer, that at least is some suggestion that the intervention of sleep, while we also have the measures of how much more they were getting, actually were at least associated with these performance outcomes.
Because one of the key things about REM sleep, which is the sort of final stage of sleep, is that it helps with muscle recovery.
Deep sleep is actually, deep sleep is where deep sleep is where it's implied that there's more muscle recovery regeneration, because there's the biggest pulse of growth hormone during your deep sleep. So to back up a bit, you have light stages of sleep, then you have deep stages of sleep, and then you have that rapid eye movement sleep, or when you dream. That tends to be more associated with consolidation of learning and memory and skill consolidation. So you go through these cycles during the nighttime, about 90 to 120 minutes, but the proportion changes through the night. The beginning of the night, you get more of that deep sleep. And then in the early morning hours is when you get more of that REM sleep. So you might have woken up in an early morning and had the recall of these vivid dreams. It's because you often will be waking up from that REM sleep.
Yes, that happened last night, actually, because I woke up suspiciously early for me. So I woke up at about 5 or 6 o'clock, and I was just kind of dipping in and out of dreams. And they were very vivid dreams that I can still remember now. So the muscle memory element of all of this, what is muscle memory, and how is that sort of implicated with sleep?
So muscle memory, there's different types of memory, and you need sleep. Think of sleep as hitting that save button, right? You need to sleep after you have learned new information, learned a new skill, so that you can consolidate those memories and be able to retrieve it later. So I always use an analogy of hitting that save button. After you learn new material or learn a new skill set, you need to go home and sleep so that it goes into long-term storage and that you can retrieve that the following day and subsequently. Without that sleep, we know that that groundwork for that new skill or that new memory is not going to be as strong. And so in the context of students who are trying to study for a test, or an athlete that's trying to remember the playbook, you want to space those intervals that you're learning that material and have sleep that follows so that you strengthen those connections.
And also, you mentioned when you were talking about one of your athletes, encouraging them to nap before a game.
Yes.
I read this fascinating word in the research that I was doing on your work. I think it's nappuccino.
Yes.
What's a nappuccino?
The nappuccino. So this is a useful tool if you're trying to have a temporary boost in alertness and performance. So the nappuccino, you go and take your favorite caffeinated beverage. The caffeine will start to kick in about 15 minutes. And you go and then take your 20 to 30 minute power nap. So if you're able to fall asleep within that 5 to 10 minutes while the caffeine will start to come on board, then when you wake up after 20 to 30 minutes, then bam, both the caffeine will have kicked in and the power nap will have kicked in. And there's research to show that that's more effective for alertness and performance improvement for a couple of hours than if you only did the caffeine alone or only did the power nap alone. So the Nappuccino is a useful tool for some who utilize caffeine, and you can partner that together with a short 20 to 30 minute nap.
So I thought, I could go Monday to Friday, I'll sleep maybe sometimes 2 hours a night, 3 hours a night, whatever. Then Saturday, I'll just do a, 11-hour sleep and I'll just make up for it.
Yeah.
Is that a good strategy?
The delightful laughter at the end of your sentence that I think probably tells you the answer that you know. Unfortunately, sleep doesn't work like that. It would be nice if it did. Sleep is not like the bank. In other words, you can't accumulate a debt as you were doing during the week and then hope to try and pay it off at the weekend. So for example, let me take an extreme version of that experiment. Let me take you tonight. I'm going to deprive you of sleep for an entire night for, let's say, 8 hours of sleep. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to give you all of the recovery sleep that you want, as much as you wish for. And then the next night, you can have all of the recovery sleep that you want. And even on the third night, will you sleep longer that first recovery night after a night of no sleep? Absolutely, you will sleep longer. But across those 3 or 4 recovery nights of sleep, will you get back all of the sleep that you lost? Not even close. You'll maybe only sleep back about 4.5 of the 8 hours that you lost. In other words, by that stage, you are 4 or 3.5 hours in overdraft on your sleep bank account. You went into debt and you only paid about 50% of it back. So what's happening with you during the week is that you're accumulating this debt, of maybe 10 hours, you're shortchanging, you're only sleeping like 6 hours a night for the 5 nights during the week. And then you binge on sleep and you try to maybe sleep 10 hours or 11 hours. That's only 2 or 3 extra hours. So sum total, that's only 4 to 6, hours of made up sleep relative to the 10 hours of debt. So what happens is that next week, you now carry forward 4 hours of your debt. And then the next weekend, you try to sleep it back, but you're still 4 hours lost. So now you've got 8 hours of net debt. In other words, what it develops is into a compounding interest on a loan. It just starts to escalate ballistically across weeks, across years, and across the lifespan.
And then what happens in terms of health outcomes? So say that I did that for a couple of years. Say that I sustained that pattern of, depriving myself of sleep throughout the week, maybe catch up on Saturday, depriving myself again the next week, catch up on Sunday, deprive myself the next week. And I did that pattern for multiple years. What would be the health implications?
So you can describe them short, mid, and long term. The first thing I would say, though, is that the elastic band of sleep deprivation will stretch only so far before it snaps. The short term, probably the most immediate short term consequence is that you are popped out in a drowsy-related accident. Because drowsy-related accidents are non-trivial. They make up a large proportion of accidents on our streets in terms of human errorful driving.
When you say popped out
of the gene pool.
Okay.
So what happens is that when you are underslept, you're at the wheel and you start to have what we call micro sleeps, where your eyelid will partially close. Now you are not aware of it. You have no awareness of it whatsoever. And in fact, parts of your brain seem as though they're almost falling asleep. Like you're having this micro sleep and it lasts for about a second or 2 seconds. Now, if you're on the motorway and you're traveling at 70 miles an hour and you have a 2-second micro sleep, that's enough time for you to drift from one lane into the next. If you're just on a 2-lane, sort of back street, where there's oncoming traffic in the other direction, and you're traveling at 40 miles an hour and you drift half the way into that lane, that's oncoming traffic. So in other words, if you have a microsleep at 60 or 70 miles an hour, at that point, there's a 2-ton missile traveling at 60 miles an hour and no one's in control. And that may be the last microsleep that you ever have in your life.
Obviously, all the other things you've mentioned would be implications, things like performance drop, sort of memory, relationships, libido, would all drop off, so I wouldn't be having as much sex, all those things. And midterm?
So midterm, then you're going to escalate those things into more disease states. So for example, if I were to take an individual, and people have done these studies, not we, but where you limit them to, let's say, 4 or 5 hours of sleep for 1 week, your levels of blood sugar are disrupted so significantly that your doctor at the end of that 1 week would classify you as being pre-diabetic. So you could almost argue that's short term, not midterm. If you're a male and I limit you to 4 or 5 hours of sleep, a healthy young male, for 1 week, I will drop your levels of testosterone to that of someone who is 10 years older than you. So I can age you by a decade just by short sleeping you for 1 week. We see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health, in estrogen, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. So it's both men and women. Your blood pressure will start to creep up. Your systolic blood pressure in particular will creep up. Your heart rate in terms of its contraction rate, in other words, the speed of your heart starts to increase. The progression into obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, suicidality, all of these things, immune compromise, infection, All of those things can be termed, will be midterm. Now, all of those things have a longer term tail to them, which is this thing called premature mortality. So using that sweet spot of 7 to 9 hours of sleep, you can argue that there's a simple truth on the basis of the data. The shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. That short sleep will predict all-cause mortality.
Is that supported by data?
That's supported by data. Now, there's an interesting change there, which is once you get past about 9 or 10 hours, your mortality risk doesn't just keep going down and down. It will hook back up again, as if almost too much sleep is a bad thing. And we can explain why that is the case as well, and why it's probably not quite as simple as that. But the final long-term consequence that I would say is Alzheimer's disease. The two most feared diseases in developed nations are cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Both of them have links to insufficient sleep, many of them causal. And this relationship between sleep and Alzheimer's disease, this is where we actually do, I'd probably say almost 50% of the work that I do at my sleep center is focused on sleep and Alzheimer's disease. And there the data is stunning. I would say at this stage, insufficient sleep seems to be one of the most significant lifestyle factors that can develop or dictate the development of Alzheimer's disease later in life. Now, that's a lifestyle factor. There are other genetic factors, but certainly we now know that it's not just that insufficient sleep predicts a greater amount of Alzheimer's pathology in your brain. So, for example, people who on average are sleeping 6 hours or less have a far higher magnitude of beta amyloid, which is the sticky toxic protein related to Alzheimer's disease, and another protein called tau protein. These are the two protein culprits of Alzheimer's. Both of those escalate the less and less sleep that you have. Now, that's just associational. We also know, by the way, that two sleep disorders, insomnia and sleep apnea, heavy snoring, both of those are associated with a marked increased risk of your Alzheimer's disease, later in life. That's simply associational. That doesn't prove causality, but we now have the causal evidence, both in animal models and in human models. If I deprive a human being of sleep for a single night, or I even just deprive you of deep sleep for a single night, the next day we can see an immediate increase in these Alzheimer's disease related proteins circulating in your bloodstream, circulating in what we call a cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain, and using special brain scans, we can even measure it within the brain itself. So these are causal manipulations. It's not associational. I manipulate this thing called sleep, and the consequence is that I manipulate your Alzheimer's disease proteins. That's correlation going to causation. Then the question is, well, mechanism. What is it about sleep when you get it that is de-escalating Alzheimer's disease risk? In other words, when you don't get it, why would it increase your Alzheimer's risk? And this was a stunning discovery made by a scientist called Macon Nedergaard at the University of Rochester here in America. And she found three things. First, studying mice and rats, she found that the brain has a cleansing system. Now, we didn't used to think that your brain had a cleansing system. Your body had one, and everyone knows what it's called. It's called the lymphatic system. We didn't think the brain had one, but she discovered that the brain has one. It's called the glymphatic system, named after these glial cells that make it up. The second thing that she discovered is that cleansing system within the brain is not always switched on in high flow volume across the 24-hour period. It was expressly during sleep, and particularly during deep non-REM sleep, when that sort of sewage system was put into overdrive and washed away all of this detritus that built up during the day. And the final thing that she discovered, and this is why it's related to Alzheimer's disease, is that two of the metabolic byproducts that build up during the day in our brain are beta amyloid and tau protein, the two bad actors in Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, so I think that there is a misconception that everyone needs a certain amount of sleep. There's individual variability. So the recommendation from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society, so two of our national organizations here in the US, recommend minimally 7 hours of sleep. But that's the lower threshold. You might actually need 8 hours or 9 hours or more to feel well rested, right? I personally feel terrible on 7 hours, and I much more need the 8 to 9 hours. And there's those in that individual differences. So you need to find what you feel well rested. You're able to function well at a high level during the day, and that will then be your individual requirement. So I think there's this misperception that everyone needs a certain amount, but you need to find what works for you, and it's all about small changes. So if you're not at 7 hours, I think you shared sometimes you're under that.
Oh, yeah, sometimes, yeah.
It's about 15 or 30 minutes more can make a difference. So if you're getting 6 hours, then I'm going to recommend getting 15 minutes or 30 minutes more every day for this 1 week, and then get 15 or 30 minutes more next week, so that you're building from, say, 6 hours of sleep to 6.5 hours. And you may not think that that's that much, but we can all do 15 minutes more, right? We're less scrolling or doing what we're wrapping up our day, but those 15 minutes add up, where that's a difference of like an A student to a B student, or 11 minutes more sleep is a difference of a B student to a C student in one of these studies.
Really?
Exactly. And then over the course of a week, 15 minutes will be almost 2 hours more sleep than if you didn't.
What was the study?
So this was a study done in high school students, but looking at the difference of how much they're sleeping versus their correlation to grades. And so that 15-minute difference was shown to be that A to B student, 11 minutes from that B to C student.
Oh, gosh.
Yes.
What are the like big overarching misconceptions that stand in the way of people believing in and or implementing the advice that you give them?
I'll start with just this badge of honor that I really believe still persists in society, where you should get only 4 or 5 hours of sleep and should be able to perform at your best. And I think the tides are turning, and I do think that that is changing over the last several years, where there are more vocal advocates of, elite athletes like the Tom Bradys who, say everything is around performance enhancement. I need to go to bed early so that I can wake up early and to be ready to go for the day, to, the Simone Biles who says I need to get 8 hours of sleep. And so I think that that is a badge of honor that is now shifting. And now it's going to become, well, if you're not getting your 8, 9, 10 hours of sleep, right, then you're actually at a decrement to yourself, and you're actually not going to set yourself up to be the best that you could possibly be, whether you're on the field as a pro athlete or whether you're leading an organization or trying to go after whatever it is that matters to you. So in this study, we looked at the men's basketball team, and we really tried to examine if we extended their sleep over 5 to 7 weeks, encouraging them to get 9 or 10 hours of sleep every single night to pay back what we call an accumulated sleep debt. Would we see any impact on performance outcomes? Specifically, would we see an impact on reaction time, their fatigue levels, and would we see an impact on their on-court performance, specifically free throw shots, three-point shots, sprint time? And these are measures that we would do after every regular practice. And over the course of those 5 to 7 weeks, we demonstrated that we saw a 9% improvement in free throws, a 9% improvement in three-point shots. We saw a 12% faster reaction time and a 4% increase in faster sprint time. And so these were the quantification, which was novel at the time, was what was quite fascinating, because it wasn't that 1% that I think many elite athletes are trying to find every small way to adjust their training to get that 1% better, because in elite sport, that 1% can be the difference, right, of being at the top versus not. But this was arguably 9% or even double digits for reaction time, depending on the outcome. And so we've expanded that looking at other sports as well, but this was one of the first ones to show that it really potentially could have a significant impact on performance outcome for these athletes.
How much did they sleep more per night to get those results?
Yeah, so they did. So we did quantify objectively through a what's called actigraphy. It looks like a wearable nowadays, and then compared that also with what they thought they were getting. And so we did extend their sleep substantially over, I believe, an hour and a half compared to what they were getting prior to the study.
How many of us are getting the sort of recommended daily allowance of sleep as a percentage? Do you know?
It seems to be about 1/3 of most modern civilizations are failing to get the recommended 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night.
1/3, so roughly 35%, 33% roughly.
Yeah.
And does that have geographic variance? I.e., in some countries it's worse, in some countries it's better. I'm thinking about the UK versus the US, or Japan or whatever.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, let me give numbers to the 3 countries that you described. Here in the United States, the average amount of sleep that people are getting is 6 hours and 29 minutes. In the UK, it's not much better, 6 hours and 49 minutes. Japan was the worst, 6 hours and 22 minutes. Now, to be clear, that's the average. What that means is that there is still a large proportion of that bell-shaped distribution of people getting even less than that amount. Now, there are some countries that you look at that are actually sleeping much better than that. I think Mexico, for example, is doing very well. If you look at Mexico City, people are actually sleeping not too far off from 8 hours. So there is variability, and we can try to understand why, which, by the way, just brings me back while I think about it to your comment of, will my work be done, not because I'm a scientist and I run a big sleep center at UC Berkeley, but the work I do as hopefully a public advocate for sleep, why I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, is because governments aren't really doing much about it. And I've tried as best I can. And if there is any government out there that listens to this that wants to work with me, I'd be delighted. I don't remember, and maybe you can, but any major first world nation government that has had a public health campaign regarding sleep. And it stuns me, because those same governments have had public health campaigns regarding, eating, regarding smoking, regarding drunk driving, regarding risky behaviors, safe sex, loneliness, mental health, suicide. Where is sleep in that equation? And it's such a fundamental ingredient. And in fact, almost all of those things that I've just described have an intimate relationship with sleep. I mean, suicide, especially, we're starting to do a lot of work with this, although it's been hard to get funding. But what we found is that insufficient sleep is a precursor to suicide. That sleep disruption seems to predict both suicide ideation, in other words, suicidal thinking, suicide planning, and tragically, suicide completion as well. So if we were to try to have governments create a public health campaign to pull this Archimedes lever on better sleep, there are so many other health benefits. Sleep is the tide that rises all the other health boats. It's almost like it's like a mixing deck in a studio, in those sound studios where you've seen it. And then there's that one button all the way to the end, the white button, sort of that when you move it up, sort of all of the other dials, the sort of the red, yellow, orange, green dials, they all move up at the same time as well. There's this like sort of one mess, there's like one ring to rule them all. Sleep is that Archimedes lever. So if governments could only execute on that, the health benefits would be manifold in terms of their consequences.
It begs the question, if I were to make you today president, prime minister, whatever, of the world, and you had to do, just a few things to really fix the lack of sleep epidemic. There you go, I've diagnosed it. What would those things be if you were in charge? How would you redesign society to help us to sleep better?
Gosh, it's such a good question. And I've thought a lot about this, almost in reverse, which is to say, why is it that we are struggling to get sleep? And there is no single answer. There are so many different reasons. And that's why it's actually a very challenging problem to solve. I would go through a descending level of steps. So first, I would start at the government level, and we would get those public health campaigns in order. Next, I would go to the professional level, because there we have this mentality in business that, sleep is for the soft among us, that less sleep equals more productivity. And that is just not true. And I can provide you with all of the evidence. So we need to get rid of this sort of sleep machismo attitude in the workplace where we wear our badge of honor of sleep deprivation on our arms. We need to get companies to actually start embracing sleep. And I can guarantee you, and I can give you all of the evidence as to why, if as a company, as a CEO, if you start prioritizing the sleep of your employees, you will be far better off as a company. You will be more product based and you will be more profitable and revenue generating. Sleep is the very best form of physiologically injected venture capital that you could ever wish for. And in fact, the RAND Corporation, which is an independent survey corporation, what they found is that at a national level, insufficient sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. So here in America, that number was $411 billion of lost profit caused by insufficient sleep. In the United Kingdom, it was over $50 billion. In Japan, it was over $120 billion. If I could solve the sleep loss crisis in the workplace, I could perhaps double the healthcare benefit for many of those countries, or I could halve the education deficit in those countries. So the next level I would target is business. Then next step down would be medicine. Medicine is a classic demonstration here. We have junior doctors, or here in America, they have doctor residency programs where people are working 20, 30-hour shifts. And so already doctors are inculcated into the mindset of the uselessness of sufficient sleep. Across numerous countries, and I think it was maybe over 8 different countries, we looked at the medical curricula and we asked how many hours of education do doctors get about sleep? And what's strange is that, often doctors, you'll go in and you'll have an appointment, they'll say, okay, how are you eating? And, what's going on with the bathroom? How's the toilet? And then, how are you sleeping? As if sleep is one of these universal health barometers. But what we found is that most doctors will only be given about an hour to an hour and a half of sleep education during their entire medical school education, which blows my mind because it is 1/3 of their patients' lives. But they're only given about 90 minutes of education. So no wonder your doctors aren't treating your sleep problems, thinking about your sleep problems, understanding your sleep. It's not their fault. And plus, they're sleep deprived anyway when they're being trained. Ironically, by the way, junior doctors who've worked a 30-hour shift, when they finish that 30-hour shift and get back in their car, they are 168% more likely to get into a car accident because of their lack of sleep and end back up in the emergency room from where they were just working, but now as a patient. I mean, the paradox, the irony just stuns me. So I would next move down to the level of medicine. Then I would go to education because we don't get taught about sleep in schools. Now, I never got one of those special classes. I got sort of, sexual education classes about drugs. No one came in and told me about the benefits of sleep. Why aren't we doing that? Then next, I would move down into the family because there is prejudice in families with sleep. It's this notion of parents of teenagers. And these teenagers, by the way, it's not their fault. They have a shift in their chronotype, in their circadian rhythm, that when they go through puberty, when they're going through adolescence, they get fast forwarded in time. So when they were 8 or 9 years old, they would be going to bed, sort of early in the evening. But now as teenagers, they seem to be stubborn and they're staying awake until midnight, 1 a.m. and they won't get into bed. It is not their fault because they have a biologically wired shift in their tendency of when they want to wake up and when they want to sleep. Why am I bringing this up about this sort of mismanagement in the home? Because parents at weekends will go into the room with the teenagers, they'll pull open the curtains, they will pull the covers off and they say, you're wasting the day. And firstly, what they're doing is probably trying to sleep off a debt that we've lumbered them with during the week because of this incessant model of early school start times, which I'll come back to. But within the home, if you ask parents of teenagers, what percent of parents think that their teenagers are getting sufficient sleep? And about 70% of them will say, yes, my teenager is getting sufficient sleep. When you look at the data, only about 15% of teenagers are actually getting the sleep that they need. So what happens is a parent-to-child transmission of sleep neglect. They're saying you're lazy, you're slothful. So then what happens? Well, in 15, 20 years' time, now that teenager has got a teenage child. What do? They go back in the room, they rip the curtains open, they say, you're wasting the day, because that's what they were told. So we need to break that down too. And then finally, we need to come to the individual and we need to solve the individual's sleep problem. So it's a very long answer, and I'm desperately sorry to a very big question as to what I would do if I was czar for a day. But I hope that gives you some sense of the depth that I think we need to go to. I've tried to think about the question a lot. It's not particularly well executed. I don't think I was very eloquent there, but I hope that gives a sense.
It sounded perfectly eloquent to me. It sounded like a manifesto. So hopefully if there are people listening from governments, which I'm sure there are, because I hear about that sometimes, which is quite bizarre, but I'm sure they'll be getting in touch with you very quickly. Going back to the top of that stack, on the company level, so as a CEO or a CFO or an employee or whatever, there are some companies that are incentivizing their team members to sleep, right? Is there any data showing the efficacy of that?
There is data that we have, and it's bi-directional, both the efficacy of when you increase sleep and also the detriment when you don't allow sleep. So a great example was NASA back in the 1980s. They were looking at using naps in the astronaut program, because when you're up and you're orbiting Earth, you will actually be cycling Earth, really quite quickly. And you will get to see, depending on the orbit, maybe somewhere between 10 to 15 sunrises every 24 hours, which sounds, amazing and remarkable. But trust me, in terms of your sleep, it is very dislocating. So they were looking at how to use naps strategically to improve performance, because the weakest link on any space mission, and we've done some work with NASA, is the human being themselves. And they can cause catastrophic failure. Now, if you make an error at work and you're here terrestrially on the ground, it's probably non-trivial. Make an error when you're up in space, it can be a big deal. So they were looking at that. And what they found was that these naps, anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour, could increase productivity on these different tasks by about 34% and increased general alertness by over 50%. And in fact, the data was so powerful that it ended up being transmitted to all of the terrestrial workers on the ground, that NASA would start to, it was what was called NASA naps. It was a NASA nap culture. Now, NASA isn't desperately compassionate by any means. It's a great organization, but they, just like companies like Google or Facebook, they understand the pounds and pennies sense, the dollars and the cents version of productivity. So anything that returns productivity, they will invest in. And some of those companies, I did some work at Google during a sabbatical, and there on their campus, they will have these nap pods, and they will have these what are called rooms, where you can go and you can take a nap. So think about 20 years ago, you would never imagine a company paying you to sleep on the job. If you were caught sleeping on the job, you'd probably be fired. Now companies are incentivizing it, not because they are thinking compassionately or empathetically about the health or the wellness of their individuals. It is because they understand that it transacts marked productivity. So NASA is a good example. When you give sleep, you get something back. But I can go back to the reverse of that. Why we think that a lack of sleep does not equal more productivity is for at least 5 reasons. First, when you survey, and we can do these studies in the laboratory too, when you undersleep employees, they will choose less challenging problems. So if you give them an array of work problems, they will just simply, check email, they'll listen to phone messages, they don't dig into deep project work. Second, of the problems that they do take on in their work, they will produce fewer creative solutions. And after all, creativity and ingenuity are supposed to be the 2 engines that drive businesses forward in terms of their productivity and their revenue. The third interesting finding that we've discovered is that when underslept employees start working in teams, they will slack off. They won't do their work. They will let other people do their work. It's what we call social loafing. So they ride the coattails of other people's hard work, which won't breed a good atmosphere in your company. Trust me. The fourth thing that we found is that underslept employees are more deviant, that they're more likely to fudge data in spreadsheets. They're more likely to falsely claim money for reimbursement that was inappropriate. The final thing is that a lack of sleep will go all the way to the top of the business chain. What we found is that the more or less sleep that a business leader has had from one night to the next, the more or less charismatic their employees will rate that business leader from one day to the next, even though the employees themselves, they know nothing about the sleep that that CEO has been getting. It's evidential in how charismatic that CEO is. So you can add all of these things up, and no wonder, if you don't snooze, you lose in the case of business in that regard. That's why I can produce, I think, a non-trivial case for business. By the way, the other aspect that is hugely costly to businesses, and when I go and speak to businesses about why they should value sleep, if you offer it on the grounds of, again, sort of compassion on mental health, you probably don't want to listen. When you convert it into the cost of the company and how much it's fleecing them in terms of their profits, then they start to pay attention. Underslept employees will take on average about 11 more days, sick days throughout the year relative to well-slept individuals. So you're essentially just paying people additionally for 11 days of work that they will never give you when you are undersleeping them. Secondly, their utilization of healthcare resources increases by about 80%. So the cost to either you, the company here in the US, where your company is paying for your healthcare, or the cost to the government, for example, in the United Kingdom, is astronomical. And also then what we call comorbid diseases, your rates of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental health conditions, all of these things escalate as underslept employees continue to get even more underslept. So there is no strong case that I've seen that leads me to think businesses should foster the mentality of insufficient sleep. Quite the opposite. So that's hopefully an answer to your question. We can look at it bidirectionally. When we give sleep back, do you get productivity? Yes. When you take sleep away, do things implode rapidly? Yes. And is it costly to your company? Very much so.
Okay, so let's dive into just some very practical strategies that I started to challenge him with, which was, we'll start with his sleep environment. We want to make your sleep environment like a cave, really dark, quiet, cool, and comfortable. Dark cave. So dark, blackout curtains, eye mask are some of the easiest tools that you can grab, but are incredibly helpful and great investment to be able to use that both at home and then when you travel, so that if you're in a non-ideal environment like a hotel room, you have, for example, an eye mask that can help dampen out the light. Making it quiet, so earplugs. Also a white noise machine. I'm a huge fan of even a small travel white noise so that you can actually mask over external noises that you may or not be able to control.
I'm someone that tells myself that I sleep with something playing. I grew up with a radio in my room, so when as an adult now, I'm always looking to play something as I fall asleep. Is that going to hurt my sleep quality?
I would say if you're accustomed to this, I would say that's fine to continue to do so. I am not a fan of having the TV on and having the bright light exposed to you in that hour before bedtime, because it also can just be very psychologically stimulating. But if, like you said, it's a radio or it's a podcast that you feel is helping you relax, then I'm a fan of it.
Do you think Diarrhea will help people relax?
It might. It might help you at least think about your sleep a bit more and challenge you to do maybe one change tonight.
We consider that to be a scientific endorsement of the podcast. Okay, so I've got sound down. You are a fan of the white noise machines?
I am, because sometimes there's external noises like a garbage truck or construction that you're not always able to control. So if you can at least mask over it temporarily, that can sometimes be helpful to keep individuals more asleep during the nighttime. And there's even some now that are adaptive. So if the door slams, then the volume temporarily increases and then will decrease. So there's almost these smart white noise machines that are coming out on the market. So that's from a noise standpoint, and earplugs are going to be helpful if you're traveling. When you're at home, you can obviously use those to dampen down any external noise. From a temperature standpoint, you want it to be cool. I think this is an area that a lot of people can benefit from because they often sleep in much warmer temperatures than what we know is probably more conducive to sleep, which is cooler. 60 to 67 degrees has been shown to help individuals stay asleep and fall asleep. That may be frigidly cold for some, but you have to find the temperature that's right for you. I would say decrease your temperature by, say, 1 degree or 2 degrees every couple of days, and then you can find the temperature that works well for you. And there's even technology now where there's mattress covers that can help you regulate temperature from much cooler to warmer. So if there's differences in bed partners, that's a way that you can actually accommodate both of their preferences.
So that's about 16 to 20 degrees Celsius.
There's more that we've done with Andre, but this is to give you some highlights. So, approaches to his sleep were having that way to process his thoughts, being able to wind down before bed and relax, improving his sleep environment so that it was, as I mentioned, dark and cool. I believe his was around 67 degrees. It was quiet. We took out technology from his bedroom so he didn't have that exposure prior to bed. We looked at cutting down some of his power naps that were several hours long to shorten them to 20 to 30 minutes and time it much closer to game time so we would get that boost as he would go into evening games. And we looked at some of his nutritional choices, but this is the highlight of some of the ways that we were strategic about his approach to sleep. And while we're also extending his sleep from that under 7 to 7.5 to 8 hours, because we knew he had an accumulated sleep debt that had been built from not getting sufficient sleep, probably for many months to years prior to this. And so as we've shared, some of the performance outcomes were astonishing, and he's been very vocal about sharing his sleep story. And he's not the only one. If I could share another story about another athlete where you've asked what has saved someone's career. So with Andre, I think he saw this performance enhancement that he could tap into that was previously he didn't know almost existed, right? But then there's other athletes where I think having sleep as a foundation almost saved their career. One example is Ryan Jensen. So Ryan Jensen was cut from the Ravens and put on the practice squad. And during this time, as the story goes, his father said, what's happening? You're not yourself. You made your mom cry the other day. There's something that's going on. And he eventually was tested for sleep apnea, which is a very, very common sleep disorder where your airway has some partial or full collapse during the night. And so it can have very fragmented sleep through the night. And he was eventually tested, diagnosed, and then put on treatment through what's called a CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure. So it's a mask that provides air to keep the airway open. So then you actually can have consolidated sleep during the nighttime. And in a very neat way, 4 years later, Ryan Jensen comes back, signs a $42 million contract as one of the highest paid centers in the NFL. And then 3 years later, in 2021, wins the Super Bowl with Tom Brady on the Bucs. I see this as the success story of saving his career. And he's been vocal about how much of a difference it made from literally almost the end of his career happening to now being able to succeed at the highest level. And also, of course, being healthier and being able to have more success on the field than he probably imagined for himself.
And better relationships. Presumably he's not made his mother cry. I'm quite curious about that. Why is it that when we haven't slept, we're more likely to make people cry?
Because our emotions are not regulated well when we're short on sleep. We are more irritable, we are more grouchy, we respond more with our emotions than being able to, why we respond with our emotions.
Yeah, what's going on in the body? Is it like a different part of my brain? Is it my hormones? Is it something else?
It's probably a combination of both, right? We know that our emotional regulation is not the same if we're well rested versus if we're sleep deprived. And so we rely more on our innate response, which may not necessarily be that which is strategic for what we should be responding with if we were tempered and had a better rest under our belt. So yes, cognitively, there's an implication of which part of your brain you're going to be using, but then also you are just not in a state in which you are going to be able to respond in the way that you would otherwise.
Is it the amygdala that's the emotional center?
That is one that's where fear is very much, and emotions and yeah, the amygdala is where fear and emotions are often centered.
Because when I started learning more about sleep and the impact it has on my emotions, I could see a huge variance in how I make my decisions, but also how short I can be if I haven't slept.
Yeah.
And so on the days now where I haven't slept, I literally have a conversation with myself and tell myself that I'm going to be in my amygdala today. So to try not to make any decisions, try not to talk to many people, because there's a risk that I might be too short in how I consider things and how I respond. And I really want to stay away from that. But I've seen such a huge variance. And I've also heard of other famous CEOs and stuff like that talk about how they focus so much on their sleep. I was reading something the other day, and it was Jeff Bezos.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm going to say?
I don't, but Jeff Bezos is someone who has been an advocate about sleep and vocal that he needs 8 hours every night.
Yes. The quote that I heard him say, or someone told me that he said, was, I think it might have been Arianna Huffington actually. He said that his job as a CEO is to make decisions. And he says he doesn't have to make that many decisions a year. He only makes a couple of big decisions a year. Every day he's probably just making 2 or 3 big decisions. So if his job is to make decisions, then his job is also to sleep. Because the variance I see in even my own decision-making when I'm slept and underslept is just unbelievably staggering. As someone that sits here for 7-8 hours a day sometimes having conversations, you wouldn't believe the difference when my brain and my mouth are connected because I've slept. It's like a different human being. It's a different podcast host. Have you got data to support this impact on cognitive performance?
Yes, so you definitely make better decisions when you're well rested. You're less likely to make cognitive errors. You have better judgment when you're well rested, and you're going to react faster. So in the situations where you need to make big decisions, whether it's on the field and you need to react because you're running a pass, whether you are Jeff Bezos and you're running a company and you need to make critical decisions under sometimes acute stressors, or you are someone who just is trying to be your best, we know that the cognitive domain brain very much is influenced by getting sufficient sleep. And some of the, I would say, large, very public disasters have happened as a result of what we know is sleep loss, where people have made poor decisions or decisions that have led to unfortunate disasters. So, for example, the Challenger disaster with a space shuttle that exploded.
Right.
And as a result, there's investigations of why did this happen. And the final report does suggest that insufficient sleep for some of those key decision makers around being able to launch or not was attributed to fatigue and insufficient sleep. So being able to make good game time decisions had this disastrous effect ultimately on the Challenger explosion.
Are you aware of any studies that have measured cognitive performance and sleep?
Yes. So my studies, as well as many of my other colleagues, particularly look at reaction time, because we know reaction time is very sensitive to sleep loss. And I'm starting to find it also is sensitive to extension of sleep. So the other half of this story, where when you pay back sleep debt, we see that benefit on reaction time. But reaction time and looking at aspects of, how quickly you're able to respond, or if you're having errors when you're responding and you're not supposed to be responding, cognitively, those are tests that are typically used in a lot of sleep studies because we know is quite sensitive.
Can you give me an example of a study that will convince me that if I sleep more, my cognitive performance will improve?
One of the studies I mentioned before, even 15 minutes more sleep was that difference of that A student to the B student. Oh, yeah. There's another study I often cite where if you look at the difference of someone who gets 9 hours of sleep for a full week, the reaction time stays very consistent. Great. You want to react appropriately. You want to not make cognitive errors or lapses in judgment, and that will be consistent over the week. If you're someone who's getting 7 hours of sleep, you see a slowing of that reaction time and then a leveling off. If you are getting 5 hours of sleep, you see an even sharper decline in being able to react fast, and then you see a leveling off. If you're getting 3 hours of sleep every night, you're just going to tank that reaction time and be slower. At the same time, you have more lapses in judgment and not able to respond appropriately. But the thing about this study that I find so fascinating is when we know that there's this deficit when you're going to react slower, in the 7 and the 5 hour group, there's this leveling off. So people say, oh, can I get used to getting insufficient sleep? In some sense, there was this stabilizing of it, but the reality is you're not at your best, right? We know what your reaction time could be if you were getting that 9 hours. And if we even gave you 3 nights of what we call recovery sleep, so we said, okay, now we get, let's say 8 hours in bed for the next 3 days, you're going to feel better and you'll probably feel more refreshed. But those reaction times for the 7 hours and the 5 hours and the 3 hour group didn't go back to the baseline. So it takes more than one night or one weekend of that recovery sleep to get you back to your baseline. And so that's the bottom line that I try to show my athletes is that you can pay back sleep debt, but it often can take more than just one day or one weekend of quality sleep.
How long does it take?
So my studies have suggested multiple weeks will really be beneficial to paying back more of your sleep debt than just a night or 2 nights of sleep. The biggest bang for your buck tends to be in the first week or 2, but obviously this depends on how much more you're actually getting, how you're timing that in your night. But the bottom line is that if you can invest maybe a week, or maybe if you have a vacation coming up and you do 2 weeks, that's going to be the biggest impact on paying back your sleep debt. And if you say, hey, that sounds like a long time, Dr. Ma, well, even potentially like 5 days, as one of my preliminary studies had suggested in professional baseball players, even if it's 5 days of getting 1 additional hour of sleep, that was shown to improve cognitive reaction time and also processing speed in the athletes that actually got 1 additional hour. So if you got 6 hours, you went to 7. If you got 7 hours, you went to 8 hours, versus the athletes that just continued to get their normal sleep.
They should do some studies on kids in school and like disobedience and ability to pay attention and do your homework and grades, because honestly, I was so useless in school, and I really think a lot of it. Now, I'm not entirely sure here because I got diagnosed with ADHD when I was like 30 years old. So part of me thinks I've just got like a very active brain. And part of having an active brain meant that late at night I was finding ways to stimulate it by playing video games, etc. So that might just be the reason. But the other reason might be that I'm an owl chronotype, and I found it really hard to get up at like 7:30 to go to school by sort of 8:30ish. And so I would miss school. I would show up knackered. I would sleep in lessons. And I feel like school just starts way too early for kids.
It's an ongoing problem, and actually, in a very interesting way, there has been a change to school start times, particularly in California. This year was the first year that school start times for high schools and for middle schools was shifted much later, because there are studies to show that when our students are better rested, they have higher attendance rates, their GPA and grades are much higher, there's less mental health issues, there's less car accidents, and so these studies have been over the last decade and longer, in which they have built evidence to help make decisions to start school time later. And that is in California, been enacted this year, and some other states are starting to follow suit. But to your point, what makes it challenging is that at the age of high school, many of those body clocks are shifted. And so students want to, in adolescence, go to bed later and wake up later naturally. That's just how our sleep changes through the life cycle. But when they stay up late and then we cut their sleep short by forcing them to get up really early for school, now they have insufficient sleep, and that builds like a sleep debt. And so they're not setting themselves up for success in school for learning and memory. So that's where, again, there's more evidence of if we can shift the school start time, get these students to have a little bit more sleep, they ultimately are better prepared for school, come to school, have less car accidents, and are just healthier students.
Do you think there's anything parents need to know about sleep as it relates to their children and sleep hygiene with their children?
I think it's important for parents to start at the early years of instilling good sleep habits, a good sleep routine, and giving their children the tools and skills to be able to make sure that it's a priority as they go through early childhood into adolescence, and hopefully then sets themselves up for making sure it's a priority for their adult life. I'm a young parent myself. I just had my first son, and so I recognize and can empathize with the struggles of getting sufficient sleep when they're very young, but then trying to instill how they can approach their sleep from early age, I think would be incredibly helpful to also just change culturally how we think about sleep, because so many of us now have never learned about sleep before or what we should do until you're an adult. But if we can make that change earlier on, I think we're going to have healthier kids, better families who are better rested, and also just this generation where we recognize this is so important that we shouldn't sacrifice it, because we're doing ourselves a disservice to letting us be the best that we can possibly be.
How old is your son?
11 months.
11 months. So how are you sleeping?
Oh, I transparently am quite tired.
Okay.
I as a new young mom, also, I don't have the ideal sleep that I know I would love. It's for a short time, but I'm trying to be strategic of the things that I can do with some of the tools that we've talked about, trying to leverage power naps. When, for example, I do have to still wake up during the nighttime to tend to him. And, the early morning starts are not always consistent. So my sleep schedule is not always consistent. So, going back to those 3 buckets we talked about earlier, like if I don't get the full duration that I want, then how do I maximize the quality, right? I've optimized my sleep environment. I try to have a process to wind down at nighttime, or the timing, and the sleep schedule is another area that you can still work on when, for example, you may not be getting the duration. So these are strategies that I try to employ when I know that I also am a work in progress and trying to get the best sleep possible.
So in other words, what you discovered is a system of, good night, sleep clean. That sleep is a power cleanse for the brain. And if you're not getting your sleep every night, it doesn't mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease next week. It doesn't mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, in a year's time. But night after night, once again, it's like compounding interest on a loan. And that's why we now believe through this causal mechanism that insufficient sleep is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Lots of people will say to me, look, there are these individuals in society who claim that they, didn't need very much sleep, who didn't sleep a lot. Margaret Thatcher has often quoted to me about that. Ronald Reagan was apparently another short sleeper. I don't think it's coincidental that both Thatcher and Reagan went on to die of the unfortunate disease of Alzheimer's.
I'm sold. Sleep is important. I get it. I'm sold. My question is, what are the things that in the modern society are standing in the way of sleep? We've touched on some of them loosely, but some of the big obvious things, the things that you would suggest doing, very actionable things we could do straight away to improve our chances of having that healthy, deep sleep that we need to be optimal in every regard of our health and performance.
There's probably, I think, 5 standard tips, what we call sort of sleep hygiene that you can do. And then I'll come on to maybe just some unconventional tips that we've sort of touched on. And we've spoken about many of these. The first thing I would recommend people to do, and this is why when some people say, oh, what about this new sleep supplement? Or, it's 40 quid for this bottle of these new sleep natural medications. I'm going to give it a try. I would say try these tried and true things first before you spend your money on supplements. The first thing is regularity. Go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time, no matter whether it's the weekday or the weekend. Your brain expects regularity. It thrives best under conditions of regularity. When you give it regularity, you can improve the quantity and the quantity of your sleep. The second thing is get some darkness at night. As I said, we don't get enough darkness in the modern world. And so the trick I would offer, and I don't like the word hack, but the sort of suggestion would be, in the last hour before bed, try this experiment for everyone listening for the next week. Dim down half of the lights or switch off half of the lights, or even 3/4 of the lights in your home in the last hour before bed.
All of the lights in every room?
In all of the rooms, switch off almost all of the light. Now, I'm not suggesting be unsafe and walk around in the darkness in the last hour. That's not what I'm saying. Just dim down, switch off half of the lights. You will be surprised at how sleepy that darkness will make you feel. And it's also an incredible behavioral trigger to signal to your brain that it is time for sleep, that darkness is around me. That's the second tip, is darkness. The third tip is temperature. Most people sleep in an ambient bedroom temperature that is too high. And you need to aim for a bedroom temperature of about 18.5 degrees Celsius, around about 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, if I'm probably butchering the mathematics there on that. But you need to get cool. Now, you can wear thick socks, you can have a hot water bottle, that's fine. But the ambient needs to be cold, because you need to drop your core body temperature and your brain temperature by about 1 degree Celsius to fall asleep and stay asleep. And it's the reason that you will always find it easier to fall asleep in a room that's too cold than too hot. So make your bedroom cold, make it dark like a cave. The fourth question would be fourth suggestion would be walk it out. And we've spoken about this, the 30-minute rule, get up, do something different, or meditate. Don't lie in bed awake for too long. Then the final two things we've spoken about caffeine. We haven't spoken about alcohol, but let me just say as the kind of headline of it, alcohol is not a sleep aid. Many people use it as a sleep aid. It is not your friend. Alcohol, again, is a sedative, so it knocks you out. The second is that it fragments your sleep. So you wake up, your sleep is littered with all of these small awakenings. Most of them you don't remember because they're too brief, but it makes for miserable, lousy quality sleep. And the final thing is that alcohol is very good at blocking your REM sleep or your dream sleep, which we know is critical for many other functions as well. So alcohol's not your friend. That's the sort of the final tip. Again, just if you're with friends, have a glass of red wine. Just know, okay, my sleep's not going to be great.
No, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. And
I'm joking.
I'm not. Yeah, whatever. It's just live life too.
Of course, yeah.
I'm not saying that.
I was thinking there about the other sort of behavioral things that we do that harm our sleep as well. We talked about coffee earlier on, avoiding that. It's weird that people drink it after dessert in the evening. So never understood that. I guess that's an old tradition. But the other thing, obviously, that the modern generation are even more susceptible to is to have a quick TikTok. Look at the social media account or something. Now, I thought, there's a lot of different products out there that are trying to help with the light that comes from these screens that I think is the cause of what's keeping us awake. But there's this little button called dark mode on my iPad. There's also one called night shift. So if I just pop that on, Bob's your uncle. and I can crack on with my screen time. True or false?
Partly true.
Oh, good. Okay, partly. So I can just pop that on night mode and dark mode, and then I can carry on using my iPad.
Partly true.
A lot of people can relate to this managing a racing mind. Athletes, performers, creatives. So if I've got a racing mind, I think as well. I think I tend to feel like I have my best ideas just before I'm about to get in bed. What would you recommend someone do if they have a racing mind?
Again, incredibly common to have racing thoughts, thinking through the day, needing to process your thoughts about how to prepare for tomorrow. So what I'd recommend is spending 10 minutes processing your thoughts outside of bed in dim light every single night. So that can mean, I would recommend you could do stretching. You could do deep breathing exercises to activate your parasympathetic system and dampen down your sympathetic system. That's what I recommend for a lot of my athletes. If that's not your thing, I recommend journaling, getting your thoughts down onto paper, or writing a to-do list. Those are easy ones that all of us can do for, even if you start with 5 minutes today. So awakenings actually can be very normal. This is a very common question I get asked is, should I never wake up at night? And that's actually not true. So you shouldn't necessarily hit your head on the pillow and then you're out for the full night and then never have an awakening. If you wake up, you go to the bathroom one time, you come back, fall asleep in 5 to 10 minutes, great. That's actually very normal. So you can have awakenings that happen even in the early morning hours, and that can be just a typical part of your sleep cycle because it can be as you're transitioning between these sleep stages that you'll have these awakenings. Sometimes you'll consciously know that you're awake, and other times you will unconsciously awaken. And so something like a wearable might actually show you that you have these awakenings during the nighttime that you don't recall. But when it becomes very frequent, then you have these awakenings and over multiple weeks, or it makes it more difficult and challenging then to function in the daytime, that's when we get more concerned about awakenings because there's a number of reasons why you can awaken at nighttime. To name a few, it could be environmental factors that affect your sleep. It could be that you had alcohol, that right before bedtime. Maybe there's caffeine that's causing you to be awake. There's also just stress, or if you just have a racing mind, that potentially could cause those awakenings. A bed partner is something that is a common culprit. Or underlying sleep apnea that can happen. And so there's early awakenings that need to be investigated with your doctor.
How much does alcohol impact my sleep in percentage terms?
I don't know the specific statistics of how that's going to impact the duration, but I will say that when we look at the studies of moderate to high consumption of alcohol, that very much has an association with more fragmented sleep, more awakenings during the nighttime. And so the quality of your sleep is significantly impaired. So if you're trying to have an important meeting the following day, an important game, or you're just trying to be able to be your best that following day, at least try to minimize or eliminate the alcohol. Or in the sleep docs world, we say drink when you wake up. We'd rather you have that alcohol in the morning or the early afternoon, not necessarily right before bed. And so that's one of the strategies, is to eliminate the alcohol right before sleeping.
What is the most popular question you typically get asked about sleep from people?
Most popular question is napping, which we've discussed.
Yeah.
Keep them short, 20 to 30 minutes. I get asked a fair amount about, can you oversleep? So no, we don't think really you can oversleep. When some people say they get, say, 9 hours or 10 hours and feel much more groggy, it's because often they've shifted their sleep schedule, or they have an accumulated debt that has built up, and then they're finally allowing their body to relax. And so now they don't have the mask of stimulating activities from their day or their work. That can affect.
I didn't read a study. One of my podcast guests told me that there is a harm to oversleeping, but I think from what I managed to ascertain, the studies they were citing just prove that people who sleep for like 10 or 11 hours typically have a higher risk of disease and mental health. But then it's hard to establish cause and effect, because if you're in bed for 11 hours, maybe you're A, depressed, and B, one would assume you're exercising and moving a little bit less. So you probably got a lot of like cardiovascular issues.
Yes, so there are studies of looking at the more extremes of less hours of sleep and then even more hours of sleep, like the 10 hours. And obviously there can be other comorbid conditions that go along with individuals like who sleep much longer. As you mentioned, you can sleep much longer because of depression or other chronic health issues. And so that's a different context of thinking about oversleeping. I think the question I typically get is, oh, I slept one night of 10 hours and I feel worse, so I'm never going to do that again. And that's actually not true, right? I think we want to have just more consistent hours that are timed, so you're not having a shift in the bedtime and wake time by like 3 hours later, because that could be why you're having that grogginess when you wake up, not because you got the 10 hours, but because you're waking up now at 11 a.m. instead of your typical, 8 a.m. wake up time. You could be more dehydrated because of that longer time. Snoring is one that I get asked a fair amount about, is it completely benign? And I would say, if you're snoring, you should go talk with your primary care doctor, and you should potentially ask about getting a sleep study. There is sleep disorders like obstructive sleep apnea we mentioned before. That's incredibly common, and that's when that airway has some partial or full collapse and can lead to very fragmented sleep, so you can wake up not refreshed because you really didn't get quality sleep during the nighttime. And snoring, I think, in our society has become just an accepted norm that can happen as you get older, but that is not always the case, that it is a benign symptom. And so making sure that you talk to your primary care doctor and potentially get a sleep study, I think, is incredibly important.
Is sleep apnea the most common disorder that you see?
Yes, it is. Sleep apnea can be incredibly common. I believe it's about 26% of people in the ages of 30 to 70. And so that, as you imagine, that's like 1 in 4 individuals. But many individuals don't actually get tested or diagnosed and then treated until they're way into their adulthood, or even past into their 60s, 70s. So with sleep apnea, oftentimes people will not wake up refreshed. They will often feel tired in the daytime. They may have a lot of caffeine or have to rely on power naps to keep their alertness up. A lot of individuals will have early morning awakenings. So in those 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, they'll wake up and not realize why they're waking up frequently. Snoring can be very common. If you've ever had a bed partner or a roommate and they've ever noted that you stop breathing or pause breathing or gasp and choke, those are very suggestive that you might have sleep apnea. And again, it is incredibly common, but very manageable. So something that I would highly recommend, if you, your bed partner, your roommate snore, just suggest to have, I would suggest they go see their primary care doctor.
And typically, is it people that are slightly overweight that are more likely and susceptible to having sleep apnea?
Yes. A lot of individuals who are overweight or obese will be more at risk for sleep apnea. As you imagine, the collapse of the airway typically is here around the neck, and so more weight typically is not helpful for apnea. But you can also be a very fit, healthy, young individual. So I work with elite athletes, and I have a number of my professional athletes who, again, are young, healthy males, but their anatomy is just more susceptible for this condition.
What are the big rebuttals you get, the big excuses that you hear from people?
I don't have enough time.
Yeah, I don't have enough time to sleep, okay.
I don't have enough time to sleep.
And what do you think of that one?
I don't think that that's true. I think we all are going to make sacrifices and priorities in our day. And I think if you are saying you don't have enough time, I think there's ways to be strategic about how you manage your time in the day. I think we all have 5 minutes to implement a wind down routine. We can all do that at the very least. I think all of us can optimize our environment. I think we all can invest in some sleep tools. I think we can make better choices about how you go about your day so you set yourself up better for sleep. So I think that those are just small adjustments, but will be huge in terms of what that will mean at night. I hear that, I will sleep, I'll sleep in the off season. Right now, in season is when I want to focus on being my best. But really, I think that's a backwards way of thinking about it. If you're thinking about optimizing your sleep when it gets to the season or the postseason, when some of the most important games come down the line, you're just playing catch up. Because if you have a sleep debt built up and you're just trying to maintain that through the season, you actually are at a deficit versus the other guy or girl on the team who has paid that back in the off season. Now you have given yourself, zero sleep debt. You're at your best. And now you're just trying to maintain that through the season.
I think the only other area that fascinates people even more than sleep is dreaming. So dreaming above and beyond the stage of which it comes from, which is principally called rapid eye movement sleep or dream sleep. REM sleep provides a set of physiological and benefits, but dreaming, we've now discovered, even above and beyond that, provides benefits, and it provides at least two benefits. The first is creativity. I was telling you that during deep sleep, you cement individual memories. You grab memories and you shift them from a short-term storage reservoir to a long-term storage reservoir, and you strengthen the circuit of those memories. So you future-proof information. But that's individual memories. What we discovered is that sleep is much more intelligent than you ever thought possible. That it's during REM sleep, and particularly during dreaming, that we take all of the individual pieces of information that we've been learning and we start interconnecting them and associating them with all of our back catalog of stored information. And so what dream sleep, one of the functions of dream sleep, is to cross-link and associate new memories together. So you wake up the next day after dream sleep, with a revised mind web of associations, and those are capable of divining solutions to previously impenetrable problems. So think of dreaming as, it's almost like informational alchemy, that you start to fuse things together that shouldn't normally go together. But when they do, they cause marked advances in your thinking, in your productivity, in your ingenuity. And in that way, you go to sleep with the pieces of the jigsaw, but you wake up with the puzzle complete. And I would argue that that's the difference between knowledge, which is remembering the individual pieces, and wisdom, which is knowing what it all means when you fit them together. That's one of the functions of dreaming. It's the reason, by the way, that you've never been told to stay awake on a problem.
Yeah.
The other function of dreaming that we know of is that dreaming provides a form of emotional first aid. That we've done a lot of work, and we came up with a theory that was called dreaming as overnight therapy. And what we've discovered is that when we go into dream sleep, particularly based on its neurochemical profile and its physiological anatomy of the brain, the dreaming brain will take difficult, painful experiences, sometimes traumatic experiences, and it will essentially strip away the bitter emotional rind from the informational orange. So let's take a step back. What makes a memory emotional? What makes a memory emotional is that at the time of the experience, that experience triggered a strong visceral reaction. And that visceral reaction is useful to the brain, and it wraps that experience in this blanket of what we call emotion. It red flags it and prioritizes it in the brain. So now you've created a memory of an emotional event. In other words, you've created an emotional memory. But what dream sleep does is then it takes that useful emotional memory and it will detox the emotion from the memory. It strips the bitter emotional rind from the informational orange. It's almost, and that's why we called it overnight therapy, so that the next day you come back and now you feel better about those experiences. So you have a memory of an emotional event, but is no longer emotional itself. You don't regurgitate that same visceral reaction that you had at the time of learning. So the brain has done this elegant trick of stripping the emotion from the memory. So that's the second benefit, is that it provides, it's not time that heals all wounds. It is time during sleep, and particularly during dream sleep, that provides emotional convalescence.
It's funny because there's the stereotype that we should never go to bed angry at each other.
You will wake up far less angry as a consequence.